A scream tore through the air, coming from the Laughing Rabbit Inn. A band of mercenaries had cornered the innkeeper, Henna, and clearly none of them were from around here. Their leader told her he only wanted to make some cool friends, the kind who'd spend all night with him, and his men laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all week. Henna warned them that if they kept it up, they'd regret it. That was enough to annoy the leader. He slammed his fist on the table and asked what exactly she thought she could do about it. That was my cue to step in. The moment she spotted me, both Henna and the villagers lit up with relief, and she rushed straight toward me. The mercenaries, sensing a fight brewing, rose to their feet before I'd even had the chance to say a word. So I opened with negotiations instead. 10 days. Henna sighed and said the ones who'd shown up this time were fewer than last time. Apparently, this group hadn't exactly been the only ones who'd tried harassing her before, and honestly, who wouldn't when she went around dressing like a pooning tail. Suddenly, the red-headed leader was furious and one of his men charged straight at us, so I grabbed him by the face and got on with closing the deal. 6 days, meals included. The very next instant, the man was sent flying into the wall. Looking like a demon, I proceeded to educate them. At the back, the villagers quietly sipped their drinks as the match officially began. The old men in the crowd cheered like it was a festival, and honestly, that was the only reason they ever showed up, to watch me beat the living hell out of back alley thugs. I was known as the strongest guard cleaner in Kasserdik. How I earned that reputation goes back 7 years. I woke up on a battlefield with no memory of how I'd gotten there. From that point on, I lived as a mercenary, fighting whatever enemy crossed my path. In one battle, I lost my footing and was about to be cut down when my commander saved me, a beautiful, fierce woman who also managed to lift my spirit back up. She called for the trumpet, and the moment it sounded, it signaled her men to charge. When the battle ended, I was left standing among the corpses. She seemed surprised I'd survived, and she checked my face for injuries with her own hands. Then, out of nowhere, rain started falling and caught us both off guard. She told me she loved the rain and that once the war was over, we should head east since it rained there often. A whistle cut through the memory before I could sit with it. The guards were rushing off to catch someone before he escaped. A few of them approached, calling me captain, and I asked where the others were. One said they'd catch up soon, though he still couldn't believe gentle Hans was capable of causing that much trouble. The other guard said he'd always figured Hans was a pain in the ass, and that you couldn't trust mages, that Hans had probably made a pact with the devil to pull this off. That last part actually caught my interest, but the first guard cut him off immediately, saying he only talked like that because he was jealous. Hans had taken his title as the most handsome man in the unit. The two of them went back and forth after that while I kept to myself. When they noticed I was walking off, they asked where I was headed. I told them headquarters. They knew Hans's rank was about to change and used the moment to trade a few thoroughly boring jokes at his expense. I didn't bother giving them any attention, knowing full well Hans was probably going to end up barbecued if he got caught. Arriving at the outer guard quarters, I met Commander Manuel. He pointed out that I was late, so I casually threw in a lie, claiming I had overslept. He immediately got straight to the point. He had heard that I was close to Hans and asked if it was true. Well, he wasn't wrong. Even after Hans went to magic school, we remained close friends. Still, I told him no, thinking there wasn't any need to complicate things any further. To my surprise, he looked relieved. He explained that what Hans had done wasn't a simple incident. He had stolen something from the Lord's daughter. Then he gave me a heads up, saying that if we managed to catch Hans, I shouldn't expect the Lord to be pleased. He asked if I understood what that meant. Hans was to be brought back dead or alive. I told the short man I would do my best. Honestly, it was pretty annoying. Because of Hans, I was on the verge of losing my own head. Just then, my men from the Kasserdik Outer Fortress Guard arrived, and together we marched toward Rainley Town. As we trudged through the downpour, the guard holding the umbrella muttered that no matter how unhinged mages tended to be, it seemed unlikely Hans would actually be hiding out in a district this grimy. And neither of them fancied slogging through District 7, a place with no decent toilets, while getting drenched for nothing. Maybe we should just fake a search and go find a beer instead. I told him to knock it off and shook my head at my own men, unable to believe these dim-witted fools were thinking about drinks when their necks were on the line. That was when I spotted a hooded figure lurking nearby. I called out, identifying myself as the outer fortress guard, and ordered him to lower his hood so I could get a look at him. He obeyed, cackling like a lunatic, remarking that it had been a while, and when the hood came off, he looked every bit the hardened criminal. I didn't hesitate, cracking him across the skull and dropping him to the ground, assuming I'd finally caught whoever had been causing trouble. Turned out I was wrong. He insisted he was just the local herbalist, and he'd actually been on his way to report a theft. That explained the familiar face, I thought, though he clearly wasn't thrilled with how I'd greeted him. Getting sucker punched for no reason wasn't exactly the welcome he'd hoped for, and between the stolen herbs and now this beating from the guard, his day had officially gone to hell. Still, Something nagged at him. Why would a thief bother stealing something as ordinary as Grimroot? That detail caught my attention. Grimroot was used to stop bleeding, so I asked which direction the thief had gone. It didn't take much to guess who I'd be chasing, and sure enough, someone out there was losing blood, and that someone was Hans. When I found him, I asked what exactly he thought he was doing. This was the same man who used to be obsessed with tidiness, and here he was, pitifully sawing at his own hand. I told him it was over, that he should just surrender while I was still being civil about it. Instead of listening, he called on his magic, seizing control of every drop of rainwater around us, an unsettling display of raw power. I figured the sheer scale of it had to be the rain amplifying his ability. Hans muttered an apology, saying he couldn't afford to be caught yet, then hurled a surge of water straight at me. I sidestepped it, but he wasn't backing down, chanting out more spells even with his hand still bleeding. Using water magic in the middle of a storm struck me as an infuriatingly convenient coincidence for him. If that was how he wanted to play it, I'd just have to close the distance and overwhelm him before he could finish casting. I'd charged in with my blades, mindful that a mage's incantations could hide dangers I couldn't see. I didn't go for a killing blow, just a shallow cut across his neck. He looked up at me with tears welling in his eyes, asking if I'd let him go. I remembered the rumors that he'd struck some kind of bargain with a demon, the kind that would leave a mark near the heart. I checked. There was nothing there. So I asked him why he'd do something like this if he wasn't bound to any demon. He gave a faint smile, saying it would be hard for me to understand even if he explained it now, but that I'd figure it out eventually. Hearing my men closing in, I felt my patience snap. I grabbed him by the collar of his robe, pulled out a healing potion, and poured it over his wound, warning him not to be an idiot and just come with me. Losing a hand over a theft already seemed like punishment enough, but it wasn't my call to make. In a world this primitive when it came to law, there were only two outcomes: innocence or the noose. So I cracked open a hidden passage in the wall and told him to disappear. He called me brother. I slapped him across the face and told him to cut that out and get moving. He sank down, cheek swelling, and still called me brother, thanking me before he slipped away. Within the walls of that small fortress on the eastern frontier of Gesertic, Hans vanished without a trace. Handsome Hans, kind Hans, friendly Hans, all the names people called him, and every one of them belonged to the same man who built a habit of stealing women's undergarments. A genuine pervert, dressed up in a good reputation. In a medieval world where hygiene, law, and basic decency were still stuck in the Dark Ages, I was the guard captain left standing there thinking, whose underwear was it this time? After a full night of searching that turned up absolutely nothing, the fourth squad was fuming. None of them had expected that kid to be such a slippery runner, not after combing through the entire city without a single trace of him. A few of the men figured Hans must have used magic to slip away. Though if his magic was really that powerful, someone pointed out, he probably would have reattached his own severed arm first, instead of just leaving it hanging. Our resident sleepyhead cut the chatter short, grumbling that he could barely keep his eyes open and needed everyone to pipe down. Not long after that, I got pulled aside for a private word. He confirmed my name and my rank, leader of Squad 4, then introduced himself as Sheriff William. One word from him could end my career on the spot, since he sat at the very top of this town, practically royalty around here. His suspicion was obvious. I'd been the only one assigned to search District 7, so had I really turned up nothing at all? He thought I'd let Hans slip away on purpose, and in my head, I had exactly one response to that: prove it. There was nothing to prove, of course. Before I could get anywhere near sorting things out, William turned up in front of Manuel, who visibly panicked the moment he saw him. William asked about the cigars he'd been smoking, remarking that they were surprisingly good quality, and wondering aloud how a commander on such a miserable salary could possibly afford them. Manuel scrambled to explain that they'd been a gift. William let it go after that, apparently deciding there was no realistic way Manuel could have embezzled enough to cover something like that. Then he turned to face me. The sheriff didn't waste time dressing it up either, issuing a flat warning that anyone caught helping a criminal escape would be treated as guilty themselves. He told me to think very carefully. I tapped the ash off his cigar, told him I understood, and privately thought, sure, whatever you say. Somehow I walked out of that interrogation in one piece. This wretched medieval world really had zero concept of basic rights. Still, that little troublemaker Hans had gotten lucky. Looked like he'd made it out clean. That's when I caught the sound of a commotion spilling out of a tavern nearby. A rough voice was going on about how charming the tavern lady was. Too charming to just walk away from. She sounded frightened, begging him to let go and stop. When the man turned around, red hair and all, it was obvious he was the one calling the shots for his group. They'd apparently just arrived in town and were hoping to make some new friends, he said, and the second those words left his mouth, his men burst out laughing. The tavern lady, clearly at the end of her patience, guessed they had to be mercenaries passing through, and warned that if this kept up, things were going to get messy. That suggestion didn't sit well with the redhead, who slammed his hand down on the table and asked what exactly she thought she could do if they decided not to calm down. The threat in his voice was enough to rattle her. That was the moment I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The instant she saw me, relief washed over her face, and the rest of the tavern lit up too, sensing a show was about to start. Honestly, they'd all just been sitting around waiting for me to show up. She hurried over to my side the second she spotted me, while the troublemakers, realizing I meant business, rose to their feet and lined up to face me. I turned to her and asked for 10 days, free lodging, as payment for handling this. She countered with 5, pointing out there weren't as many of them this time. We hackled it down to 6, and the mercenaries across from us just stood there looking baffled that a couple of commoners would dare bargain like that, right in front of them. The redhead's temper flared immediately, and the bald one in his crew was the first to charge, swinging a punch straight at me. I didn't so much as flinch. I just caught his face in one hand and squeezed. I asked him if he had no manners, then turned to Henna and said, 6 days with a free dinner today. Deal? She accepted, even though she had no idea what it meant. He couldn't move an inch after that. I gave him a light toss, and even that was enough to send him flying. I told a lot of them it was time somebody taught these medieval fools some manners. The old regulars sitting behind them had clearly seen this exact scene plenty of times before. 1 punch each was usually all it took to straighten them out, and sure enough, I had the whole group on the ground within a few moves. Even putting everything they had into it, none of them managed to push me back so much as a step. Around here, people had taken to calling me the garbage cleaner, Captain Aaron of the Violent Guard. The old men just kept watching from their seats, clearly enjoying the show, and I figured they probably deserved a beating of their own for how much they loved this. One of the mercenaries went for a dagger, so I gave him a cold warning that he'd better think it through, since he only got 1 shot at this. That was enough to make the redhead back down fast. With that, my shift was officially over. Back in my room, exhaustion hit me all at once. There was a sword tucked under my pillow. As I drifted off, that woman crossed my mind again, the same as always, telling me not to look back, to get out of there, to survive no matter what. A second later, I jolted awake, sword already pulled from under the pillow, only to realize it had just been another dream. The next morning, I dragged myself out of bed early and headed to the city gate for my usual sword drills. It had been 6 full years since I'd landed in this world, and even I couldn't say how much longer this quiet stretch would last. Mid-drill that day, a voice complimented how clean and efficient my swordsmanship looked, admitting he hadn't expected to find someone of my caliber tucked away in a border town like this. I didn't recognize the man, had never laid eyes on him before, but the crest stamped into his shoulder armor and the spiral-spiked weapon resting at his hip left no doubt about what he was. This one was a knight. Knights were meant to be a rare breed, wielders of holy power trained specifically to fight demons, so I couldn't figure out why one of them would bother showing up in a backwater town like this. My grip tightened without me meaning it to. Had the Empire sent this man to finish me off? Because he quickly waved it off, telling me not to get so guarded, that my swordsmanship had simply impressed him enough that he couldn't resist saying something. Then he asked which knight order I belonged to. Before I could answer, a woman's voice cut in, scolding him for wandering off and leaving her behind. That was Vivian, the sole daughter of the Cassidy Lord's household. It was only then that she seemed to notice me standing there too, asking if we'd been in the middle of a conversation. I straightened up and gave a proper bow, introducing myself as Aaron, leader of Squad 4 of the Cassidy Outer City Guard. She lit up at the sight of me, thanking me for my efforts the last time we'd crossed paths. I kept my head lowered and told her protecting her was simply my duty, nothing worth thanking me for. Privately, though, I couldn't help wondering why she'd suddenly been assigned a new night escort. She tugged Ben along with her, telling me they wouldn't keep me from my training any longer, though she'd still need me to keep up the patrols and maintain order as usual. Ben, for his part, looked genuinely rattled by the whole exchange. An ordinary guard shouldn't have had strength anywhere near a knight's level, and the way he'd looked at me made it clear he'd noticed. Still, as long as he didn't come looking for trouble, I had no reason to give him any. The moment I reached my post, my superior tore into me, cursing me out and asking why I hadn't just gone and died already. I had no idea what had set him off until I found out the men I'd roughed up the day before turned out to be mercenaries on an actual assignment. I couldn't help but think it was hard to feel guilty about it. A group of mercenaries swaggering around like street thugs were basically asking to get flattened. Still, mission or not, the damage was done, so I headed over to the administrative office to sort things out with Nopo. The instant I walked through her door, her fingers froze mid-motion. She gave me a look and asked what exactly I thought I was doing. showing up to cause trouble every single day, and reminded me that this time my mess had landed squarely on her desk. She ran the town's administration and had a reputation as the shortest-tempered person in the entire place. But this time, I'd actually come prepared. Kai, the resident pretty boy of my squad, had walked me through a few tricks beforehand, starting with keeping a slight smile on my face while I talked. That alone made her pause, asking if I'd lost my mind. Next came step 2, compliment something about her. I told her, still smiling, that her hairstyle today reminded me of a ripe orange from behind, the kind that made me want to take a big bite out of it. Instead of softening up, Nopo looked even more irritated, clearly questioning my sanity, though deep down she already knew this was just who I was. She explained that the men I'd cleaned up the day before had been mercenaries headed for Burt City on assignment. I told her that hardly mattered given their level. They were barely a step above stray dogs, and wouldn't have been much help even if they had made it there. That set her off completely. She snapped at me to shut up and listen, laying out the situation plainly. I'd be taking over the mercenaries' job myself. No room for refusal, and I'd be compensated for it. Besides, she added, this entire mess was my doing in the first place. Honestly, I hadn't planned on turning it down anyway, seeing as I really had caused the whole problem. Still, I wanted to know what exactly the job entailed. She told me the mission was escorting a carriage to the next town over, and that was how I found myself roped into playing bodyguard. It struck me as strange, though, that a single carriage would need this large an escort, especially one stacked mostly with mercenaries. Something about it didn't sit right. I turned to the red-haired man walking beside me and asked who was actually riding inside the carriage. Looking closer, I realized he was one of the mercenaries I'd already worked over a few days back, and there was something distinctly weasel-like about his face. He snapped that his name was Dylan. I told him he'd better start talking straight or I'd give him 2 more reasons to remember me. Up ahead, someone called out that night was falling and mentioned a small village nearby where we could stop for the night. The second I heard about a village, something made me narrow my eyes. An hour later, we reached it, only to find the place completely deserted. Someone floated the idea that the villagers had simply fled, while another voice wondered aloud if demons had been involved, which earned him an immediate warning to quit saying things that morbid. Meanwhile, Dylan noticed I'd broken off from the group and scrambled after me, calling out for me to wait, first as boss, then switching to brother Aaron, practically tripping over himself to keep up. As I passed one of the carriages, the woman riding inside offered the faintest smile. Dylan stuck close behind me the whole way, and something about this place stirred up an old memory. I'd once handed a book to a child here, who'd smiled and thanked me, calling me Sir Knight, asking me to come play with him next time I passed through. I stopped walking so abruptly that Dylan nearly crashed into my back. At my feet was a pool of blood. He spotted it too, right as I found myself frozen, staring straight ahead. I warned him, whatever he did, not to look up. He looked up anyway, and what greeted him was row after row of bodies strung up above us. His jaw practically hit the ground before he dropped and started retching. I'd long since gone numb to scenes like this, but what caught me off guard was a voice calling out, one I recognized instantly, addressing me as Captain Aaron. I spun around to find a woman in a long dress standing behind us, and I couldn't begin to guess what she was doing in a place like this. It was Lady Vivian. That evening, the mercenaries brought on as guards crowded around a massive cauldron for a bowl of soup. They seemed genuinely surprised at how much meat had gone into the stew, and one of them even admitted that if the food had turned out to be as grim as everything else about this trip, he'd have packed up and walked off right then. Dylan couldn't get over how relaxed they all were. How could anyone eat after what we'd just seen strung up back there? He wondered aloud what kind of madman was capable of something like that. Another mercenary sidled over and explained it as a sacrifice, some ritual meant to offer humans up to demons, and mentioned that they hadn't eaten yet either before offering us a sip of wine. I turned it down since alcohol had a way of dulling the senses. Dylan, on the other hand, never wanted to pass up a drink, took him up on it, though I warned him that if he threw it back up later, I'd finish the job myself. The mercenary introduced himself as John, the one running this convoy, and admitted he didn't recognize our faces, asking if we were mercenaries too. I told him I was just picking up some part-time work. He seemed to accept that easily enough, though he advised us to eat properly and rest when we could, since this trip might turn out rougher than any of us were expecting. Just then, Dylan spotted a far cleaner-looking carriage rolling by and recognized Vivian, the woman people like to call the flower of the East. He'd already noticed her earlier and wasn't shy about admitting how striking she was. John studied her for a moment, clearly sensing this mission was more than a simple escort job, though he hadn't expected someone like Lady Casserdick, let alone her personal knight, to be riding along with us. I found myself replaying the earlier moment when I'd asked her why she was even out here. She'd answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, claiming she was simply out for some air, that staying cooped up in the castle all day was suffocating, and that her father had suggested this trip to Bolt Fortress. I wasn't buying a word of it and pressed her on whether this was actually her father's order, but Ben cut in before she could answer, insisting that was enough, that knowing too much came with a weight of its own, and that everyone was better off sticking to what their position actually required. I kept turning that over in my head. John noticed and remarked that I seemed oddly composed given the circumstances, pointing out that a demon might actually show up and asking if that didn't unsettle me at all. I told him we had a knight traveling with us, and knights existed for exactly that purpose, trained from the ground up to fight demons as part of the Empire's elite. Between that and the sword at my side, I'd made it through worse odds before. He seemed to sense there was more to my past than he wanted to dig into, so he let it drop and wished me luck instead. That night, back in my quarters, I pulled out the book I'd once given to that boy, thinking it had been a while since we'd last crossed paths, and wondering if Horn had grown any taller since then. A presence brushed against me out of nowhere, and I reacted instantly, driving my fist forward before I even registered what it was. Turned out to be a zombie, eyes glinting with hunger, screeching about wanting a taste of my flesh. I didn't hesitate, cutting it clean in half with my sword. Before I could even process what was happening, screaming broke out from outside, where Dylan was flailing his blade wildly at a zombie that honestly looked unimpressed even in its undead state. I stepped in and took its head off without much effort. Dylan latched onto my leg immediately, demanding to know where I thought I was going without him. I told him to calm down and asked where everyone else had gone. According to him, it was chaos out there, every mercenary and soldier dead asleep and not budging, like they'd been hit with some kind of spell. I wondered if it really was magic, though that raised the obvious question of why the two of us were still fine. Then it clicked. The stew hadn't been poisoned. It had been drugged with something to knock everyone out cold. Whoever was behind this wanted someone taken alive, and my money was on whoever was riding in that carriage. Dylan glanced down the street and pointed out, with a fair bit of panic, that we had what looked like dozens of zombies bearing down on us. I stepped in front of him, telling him it was about time things got started.
It's about to go down.
And figured I'd loosen up on these sluggish zombies before the real fight kicked off. I lit into them with a rapid string of slashes, making as much noise as I could to draw every last one of them my way. And sure enough, they came shambling straight toward the end of whatever half-life they had left. It didn't take long before the street was littered with their bodies and I was finished. That's when I felt one more presence approaching. I turned, sword ready, and stopped myself just short of striking. Standing there was the same boy from before, the one I'd handed that book to. Horn. I'd guessed right. He really had grown taller. With that thought settling in, I raised my sword high. 2 years back, while hiding out in a village to shake off the people chasing me, I'd met a boy who insisted on calling me Sir Knight. I never understood why, until he showed me that he'd picked it up from a book, convinced that knights were strong and impressive. That was Horn, a farmer's son with a genuine love for books, who told me he called me that because I was the strongest, coolest person he'd ever laid eyes on. I told him he talked a lot of nonsense and ruffled his hair. I'd never been the type to grow attached to people, but something about that kid got to me anyway. Even after I settled into Cassardicke Fortress, I kept finding excuses to visit him. I told him about the city library, packed floor to ceiling with books, and the librarians who spent their entire lives buried among them. That was all it took for Horn to decide that was exactly what he wanted to become. I told him a bookworm like him was built for the job. I swung my sword down with everything I had. People say demons feed on human fear. I remembered a time Horn had come to me bruised, admitting his father had beaten him after he announced he wanted to be a librarian instead of taking over the farm, since apparently a farmer's son had no business wanting to be anything else. But that idea about demons and fear was wrong. What they actually fed on was despair. I dropped the sword from my hand and pulled him into my arms instead. I told him I wasn't really a knight, not in any way that mattered. My grip tightened just slightly as I said it, and his arm went limp against me. I was nothing more than a guard in a small border town, I told him, and I was sorry I hadn't been able to protect him. The instant I'd taken his life myself, a chaotic scramble of footsteps came up behind me. Dylan came bursting in, shouting that we'd made it, having apparently gotten so worked up moments earlier that he'd started throwing punches at the sleeping bodies around him, which somehow ended up shaking them awake. I told the mercenaries to get moving and clear out whatever zombies were left. Horn's eyes hadn't closed yet, so I reached down and shut them myself, telling him quietly to rest easy and hoping that whatever came after death, he'd never have to face anything like this again. Right then, a thunderous explosion tore through the air behind us. I picked my sword back up off the ground and started walking toward the source of it, promising him silently that I'd make them pay for this. By the time I got close, the fighting was already well underway. Ben had already taken down several assassins, and from what I gathered, someone back in Cassardicke City had wanted the young lady dead, which was the whole reason she was being quietly moved to Bird City in the first place. Somehow, Despite all the secrecy, whoever was after her had still tracked us down. Still, protecting her was his duty as a knight, and he wasn't about to lower his blade, not even for the most vicious demon standing in front of him. Ben was clearly trying to bluff the thing into backing off, but it just answered with a cold, amused smile, pointing out that all his talking wasn't going to heal the wound eating away at him. The short blade that had cut him had been laced with poison. And between that and however much of the drug stew he'd eaten, the exhaustion creeping through him was only going to get worse. It asked, mockingly, whether he actually thought he stood any chance of winning like this. Ben, breathing hard, shot back that the demon's ugliness alone told him everything he needed to know, that cheap tricks were clearly the only thing it had going for it. That comment landed hard, and several eyes snapped open across its arm before it lunged forward, closing the gap between them in an instant. Ben's stomach dropped. The holy energy inside him had been cut down to maybe half its usual strength. The demon wasn't about to waste an opening like that. Ben dodged on instinct, scanning desperately for any weakness. And before long, he thought he'd spotted one. Pushing through the numbness spreading across his limbs, he forced out one final strike, tearing straight through the demon's head. But a second later, the demon's hand clamped down around his skull. The opening had been bait all along, deliberately left open just to draw him in. It sneered that knights amounted to little more than this, tightening its grip until Ben coughed up blood, gagging violently from the pressure. Right at that moment, though, the demon's eyes went wide, because I'd slipped in behind it without it noticing. I'd come there for one reason, to settle the score for Horn. I raised my sword and brought it down clean, taking the demon's head off in a single stroke. Or so I thought. The demon immediately reacted, striking me with enough force to send me crashing into the wall. He then began regenerating his head, furious as he wondered what on earth had just happened. Because of some bastard who wasn't even a knight, he had wasted his precious blood, thinking that before he ran out of the blood offered as a sacrifice, he needed to hand Vivian over as quickly as possible. I then asked him about Horn, shouting that this was revenge for him. With that, I lunged forward and crashed into him violently. He managed to shove me away, but I still landed a solid hit. I told it to heal up quick, because every time it patched itself back together, I'd just cut it right back down again. Its arm started twitching uncontrollably against its own body, and it let out a scream, apparently realizing that same arm had started feeding on its own blood, dragging it toward being fully consumed if this kept up. I watched it happen and asked what was wrong, figuring I'd expected it to at least take a couple of solid hits. But apparently it was weaker than that. I didn't let up, pressing forward with another strike, telling it plainly that all of this was for Horn. The demon clearly had no idea what I meant, and voicing its confusion over how someone who wasn't even a knight could be pulling this kind of strength out of nowhere. As I kept driving it back, something caught my attention, and I knocked the demon aside just in time to block a strike coming at me from behind. It was John, who remarked that I clearly wasn't just built like a wall. I told him I'd been wondering when he'd finally crawl out of hiding. He shot back that I was sharper than I looked too, calling me a solid package overall, built like a bear on the outside but apparently running like a fox underneath. As our blades kept clashing, I laid out my reasoning. The villagers had been sacrificed, and he'd conveniently shown up right on cue, which made it hard not to suspect he was the one orchestrating all of this. He answered that with a rough strike of his own, telling me that if it weren't for him, this whole thing would already be finished. While we traded blows, the demon started stitching itself back together behind us, though its arm kept trembling out of control. It told me, almost mockingly, that it was already too late, that this particular body had outlived its usefulness anyway, and that it had already set its sights on something far more appetizing to take over instead. Eventually, John managed to shatter my sword outright. Cheap thing that it was, probably already worn dull from everything it had been through fighting the demon. Thinking the fight was as good as over, he lunged in with a dagger, but I caught him with a counterpunch straight to the face, hard enough to knock him out cold on the spot. I turned back to what was left of the man the demon had consumed, his body now serving as nothing more than a vessel for its will. Its core pulsed with hunger as it pressed me for an answer, declaring that this magnificent being intended to take me next, and asking, almost gleefully, what exactly I planned to do about it. Seeing as I no longer had a sword to swing and wasn't even a knight to begin with, I didn't care about any of that. I charged straight in and threw everything into one punch. The demon didn't so much as flinch. I unhinged my jaw as wide as it would go and sank my teeth straight into its flesh, tearing a scream of pain out of it. If anything, it sounded almost delighted, admitting it was impressed I'd gone this far. That's when the memories hit. My old comrades flickered in front of me, Golgi, the gladiator, arguing with Wei, the gambler, as always, while Mage Avery stood beside them laughing, telling Golgi to hand her money back, Good times, all of it, the crew from my mercenary days. Then came the commander, turning to face me through a haze of swords and arrows, asking if I'd forgotten what he drilled into me, that survival came before everything else, no matter the cost. The chains binding me started to crack apart. I jolted awake without warning. Ben was already there, telling me I'd finally come around after being out cold for quite a while and asking if I was doing all right. I shot back that I was surprised he was still breathing, since I'd assumed the demon had already finished him off. He said the same thought had crossed his mind about me. That's when I noticed my body had healed completely. The only thing missing was any real memory of what had actually happened. Ben mentioned that when he'd come to, he'd found me sitting right there, apparently lying in the exact spot where the demon had been, and flatly refused to believe I'd had nothing to do with its death. I wasn't about to confirm anything, so I just told him I didn't remember a thing. Either way, with the demon gone, things had swung in our favor. Still, it nagged at me why demons had targeted a young lady who seemed to have no idea what was going on. Ben laughed at that, asking if I always talked about nobles with so little respect, then added that some things just weren't mine to know. He admitted, though, that he felt like he owed me a serious debt and formally introduced himself as a knight of Burt City, thanking me properly this time. I had no interest in getting tangled up with him any further, so I just told him not to mention it and left things there. The next day, we started by burning the zombies. An entire village had been sacrificed just so someone could summon a demon capable of killing the Cassidy heiress, which told me this whole situation ran a lot deeper than it appeared. I figured I'd need to watch my stat more carefully going forward. Once the bodies had all been cremated, the group turned back toward Cassidy City, agreeing to let it be known publicly that Ben was the one who'd taken down the demon, with no other witnesses besides the two of us. That story worked out fine for me too, since word getting out that I'd had direct contact with a demon would drag the church into an investigation, and that was the last complication I needed. At least there'd be a decent bonus waiting on the other end of this. Dylan popped up behind me out of nowhere, asking why I was walking so fast. I honestly hadn't expected him to still be alive, having assumed he'd died back there, but somehow he'd managed to hide himself among the corpses and pull through. Tougher than I'd given him credit for, apparently. I knocked him aside with an elbow and told him to quit sticking to me like glue. The following day, I found myself staring into a mirror, convinced my eyes were deceiving me. They weren't. There was an actual eye sitting on my chest, and as I watched, it slowly blinked open, asking if I was up early. I nearly lost it right there when the thing spoke, yanking out my dagger and driving it straight into the thing without a second thought. It was like stabbing solid steel. The eye practically purred, telling me that felt nice and suggesting I try a little higher next time. I told it in no uncertain terms to shut the hell up. Downstairs, the tavern owner heard the commotion and clearly had no idea what to make of it. After wearing myself out trying everything I could think of and asked if it was that demon. Looking back, I felt like an idiot remembering I'd actually torn off a chunk of its flesh with my own teeth. That explained the missing memories. It told me not to get the wrong idea, insisting none of this had been intentional on my part, that it had simply latched onto me while trying to take over my body. I told it to get out and go possess someone else instead, or I'd carve out the flesh around it too. It informed me that wasn't really my call to make, and that finding its way back to its nest would take some time. When I asked how long, it thought it over and estimated roughly 100 years. Not willing to waste any more breath arguing, I just drove my sword straight into the eye. Secretly, the thing seemed pleased by that. It told me to calm down, insisting being possessed by it wasn't nearly as bad as I assumed, and that it owed me a proper demonstration of exactly what it was capable of. A second later, a green glow lit up the room and wrapped itself around my sword. That caught me off guard. Could this actually be holy power? Ben had wielded that same energy before, and I never would have guessed a demon could pull something like that out of thin air. But just as quickly, the light vanished entirely, leaving me speechless. The demon looked utterly drained, though it wasn't about to admit it, insisting instead that it had proven its worth before its eye slowly drifted shut. Turns out this thing was pathetically weak. Right then, a loud knock rattled the door. The tavern owner had picked the absolute worst moment to come upstairs. She called through the door that someone was here looking for me, and it turned out the visitors had come from the monastery of the Cassidy City Church. The man turned out to be shockingly rude, shoving the tavern lady straight out of his way, announcing he had no time to sit around waiting and demanding to know if I was upstairs. He hollered up that Ben wanted to see me and told me to quit stalling and get moving. I answered with a fist straight to his nose, telling him his face was hard enough to look at that it made me want to finish the job, and that I'd come down whenever I felt like it, so he could just lie there and wait. A little while later, I made my way downstairs. The tavern lady brightened the second she spotted me, telling me to hurry back since she'd recently picked up a massage technique that apparently felt incredible, though the price tag on it was way more than I cared to spend. She looked genuinely wounded by my lack of interest and immediately dropped it to 40 copper coins instead. That surprise visit from the monastery had rattled me plenty, but after all that panic, it turned out Ben simply wanted a word. I figured he might be planning to cut me in on part of the demon hunting reward, and as it happened, that was exactly what he'd already worked out the day before. He asked, half joking, if I really wanted him to take full credit for exorcising the demon. I told him that was fine by me so long as he shared a piece of the reward, since I wasn't the type to turn down money out of principle. He laughed at that, promising he'd call me over the moment the reward got handed out. Say what you want about the guy, but for a night, he clearly understood how the world actually worked. That got me thinking though. Holy Aura, the power meant to strike down evil and enforce justice, was supposed to belong exclusively to knights, people personally selected and trained by the Empire, and hardly anyone outside that circle. I'd always taken that as a given, but the power I'd seen the demon pull off had looked far too similar to Holy Aura for comfort. Distracted by thoughts of the reward money, I asked Taffy how much longer this was going to take, and he said we were nearly there. Something in that name always confused people, since it actually stood for half a noble, a nickname that fit perfectly given he was the illegitimate son of an illegitimate noble. That comment nearly brought him to tears, and he swore he'd get me back for it someday. Before long, we arrived at our destination, the Sun Church Hall itself, and a cold sweat broke out across my back on the spot. Surely I wasn't about to get finished off here of all places. Not with a demon riding shotgun inside my own chest. Once we stepped inside, Ben looked genuinely pleased, telling me I'd finally shown up after he'd been waiting a good while, and asking if getting summoned so suddenly had spooked me. In truth, Ben wasn't what worried me at all. Someone stepped forward to greet me right away. The priest running this hall, a man named Blaine, with another figure standing beside him introduced as Joanna, an inquisitor of heresy, and both of them had reputations built on serious devotion. Something about the way she looked at me set me on edge immediately. The next instant, she threw a punch straight at me. I drew my blade on reflex, only to realize her fist had barely grazed me. I stood there baffled. Blaine explained that this was a blessing, personally granted by the Inquisitor of Heresy herself, and it turned out that whole exchange had actually been some kind of religious ritual. The demon inside me grew visibly irritated through all of it. Blaine spoke again, saying he'd already heard about the significant help I'd given Ben, and offered a small token from the church as recognition for my effort. The moment I laid eyes on what he was offering, I froze. There was a genuinely impressive pile of gold coins there, and tucked in the middle sat a badge I barely gave a second glance to at first. I tried to wave it off, insisting it was far too generous, but Blaine told me to accept it without a second thought, hoping only that if the Sun Church ever found itself in trouble down the line, I'd be willing to lend a hand. Rumor had it that plenty of the nobles and powerful figures around Casarda City were corrupt, and Blaine's name reportedly came up in that same conversation more than once. If I ever decided to align myself with him, there was likely a lot to gain, considering he stood as this era's true religious authority in every practical sense. Joanna, standing beside him, looked completely at a loss for words. By the time I made it back, my whole squad just stared at me, dumbfounded. I asked what exactly their problem was, wondering if maybe my new armor just wasn't impressive enough for them. As far as they were concerned though, I looked less like a decorated guard and more like some tacky new money show-off, and they figured that gold would have been better spent settling my running tab at the tavern instead of buying gear. That's when Charlotte cut in, informing the two of us that we still owed her another round of beer, setting the drinks down and telling us to enjoy ourselves. She'd actually been looking for Brig, who wasn't on shift that day, and it got me wondering whether she had a thing for him. Decent men were in short supply around Casarda City after all. She mentioned that she planned to give him a massage the next time their paths crossed, which immediately reminded me of what the tavern lady had said earlier. Either way, the beer itself left a lot to be desired, far too warm for my taste, and I found myself missing the ice-cold drafts I used to have. Charlotte suddenly perked up, mentioning she'd heard about a crew of gambling scammers who'd recently rolled into town. That rang a bell. An inn called the Sickly Mermaid had apparently taken in a wave of outsiders lately, who'd set up a gambling den on the side to go with it. As it happened, Dylan was sitting in on one of those very games at that exact moment, thoroughly convinced something was off after losing 5 rounds straight. Word was there was a little girl somehow running the entire dice operation behind it all. I slammed my cup down on the table. Bold move for a kid that young, running a gambling racket right in the middle of my territory. As captain of the Casatic Outer City Guard, there was no version of this where I could just look the other way. Kel dropped to his knees on the spot, practically begging me not to go anywhere near it, but I just smirked and told him we were about to shut that operation down for good. Once I'd shed the armor, I headed to the gambling den with one of my men trailing behind, clearly wondering why I'd dragged him along. As for me, the The whole place just felt like home the second I caught that familiar gambling smell, and I went straight to Joseph, the one who'd spotted me, asking where the dice table was set up. He looked genuinely stunned, asking if I hadn't sworn off gambling entirely. I told him this was just one last round before I walked away for good, since I finally had some real cash on me for once. Word had it there was a kid at that table who was surprisingly skilled with dice, and I wanted to see that for myself. We traded a few ties early on, and I upped the stakes each time, pushing for double or nothing. The girl running the table went along with it, privately thinking I was a complete idiot. She'd thrown a few rounds on purpose earlier just to bait me, and now that I was betting recklessly, she figured the trap had worked perfectly. The man beside her let out a cough, the signal to start reeling me in. As far as she was concerned, there was nothing left for me to do about it, since there was no way I'd guess she could swap the dice using magic. She almost felt bad about it, but she was fully prepared to drain every last coin out of my purse. That's when I slammed my cup down and told her to cut it out. She was cheating with magic, plain and simple. That caught her completely off guard, and she shot to her feet demanding proof. I had plenty. I told her the roll she'd been about to hand me was a 4, and sure enough, when I flipped my cup, there it was, a 4, staring back at both of us. I put every coin I had on the table, betting it all on the fact that she was using magic, telling her she was welcome to run if she was scared. Using some young mage to prop up a filthy little scam ring like this was hardly a new trick. The man who'd given her the signal reached for his weapon, having clearly figured out by now that I wasn't the fool he'd taken me for. Fine, he said. That just made this quicker. If I didn't want to end up dead right there, I'd drop every coin I just won and clear out. I calmly tucked the money into my pouch instead, wondering aloud if these people had never learned Rule 1 of gambling, that you don't bet on something you're not sure about. If even one of them had known who I actually was, none of this would have happened in the first place. Since the dice game with the girl had been genuinely entertaining, I figured, why not one more round? I dropped a gold coin on the table, a real one straight from the solar church, and asked if that would cover it. That got a reaction out of everyone, plenty of them clearly seeing a coin like that for the first time in their lives. One man who hadn't joined the others yet spoke up, asking what exactly I thought I was doing, given that I already knew they were running a scam and that the girl was a mage. Was I really still willing to keep playing after all that? I couldn't help wondering why the supposedly biggest gambling scam crew in the world talked this much. Nervous, maybe? The one who seemed to be running the show got irritated at that and demanded I repeat myself. He slammed his axe down on the table and agreed to the bet, putting up everything currently sitting in the girl's hand. He turned to her, warning that if she botched this round, he'd take her hand for it. As the betting continued, I found myself wondering why a mage with her kind of talent wasn't off at some academy instead of stuck running with a crew like this. Had magic just not worked out for her, or was money the real issue? Maybe scraping together enough to actually afford enrolling somewhere? She stopped mid-motion at that, pulling her cloak back and snapping at me not to assume I understood her situation when I knew absolutely nothing about her. I figured that reaction told me plenty, that I'd queerly touched a nerve, though it was starting to look like she was mostly just stalling for time now. The boss muttered that he was sorry, but once someone knew who they really were, there was no version of this where they walked out alive. The instant I lifted that cup again, he'd already decided I was as good as dead. I turned to the girl, whose name I'd learned was Kana, and asked if she could freeze a mug of beer with magic. She confirmed it, saying basic ice magic would handle that easily enough, though she couldn't figure out why I was asking something like that out of nowhere. A dangerous little smile crept across my face right before I flung my cup straight into the boss's face and let the fight begin. The dice game itself worked simply enough. 2 dice shaken in a cup, added together, and whoever landed the higher final digit took the round, which was why people also called it the Warrior's Bet. Folks like to say someone favored by the moon could never lose. I tore through the scammers one after another, the boss convinced at one point that he'd landed a clean hit on me with his axe, though I couldn't help thinking he should have been more embarrassed than proud. A grown crew of men exploiting a little girl like this. Bunch of medieval trash, all of them. I grabbed the boss by the throat and told him exactly that. That shame should have come first. That's when I caught a ripple of dark magic building up behind me. Another one of the scammers rushing in with a dagger drawn. I didn't even bother flinching. Impressive in the way, choosing to die alongside his friend rather than live with the disgrace. I simply stepped out of the way, letting the man's blade sink straight into his own boss instead. From there, I finished off the rest without much trouble. Kana stood there watching the whole thing, clearly stunned that I'd taken every last one of them down barehanded. She tossed the gold coin back to me, mentioning that this particular guy always seemed to end up brawling whenever he sat down for a dice game, and admitted she recognized him, the blade-wielding assassin wanted over in the next town, apparently known for his knife work. I told her that wasn't any concern of mine and turned my attention to her instead, asking where the Fridge Kid, my nickname for her by then, planned on going now. She immediately started begging me not to kill her. I asked why on earth I'd do that, and instead asked if she wanted to make some real money. If she agreed to pour me a cold beer every single day, I'd set her up with steady room and board and a real path toward the Magic Academy. What did she think? Was she in, with nowhere else to turn and something about me apparently striking her as trustworthy enough? She agreed on the spot. Sometime later, I was going through my usual training when the little cheat from the gambling den showed up behind me. Though these days everyone had taken to calling her mini fridge instead. I took the beer she handed over and knocked back 2 enormous gulps, and honestly, nothing had ever tasted quite that satisfying in what felt like forever. That got me thinking though. How old was this kid exactly? She told me 12. That threw me a little, since she looked far too small for 12. Was she part dwarf or something? Charlotte wandered over right around then, asking, half joking, if the little girl was actually my daughter. I nearly choked on my drink, spraying it everywhere, asking what on earth she was talking about, since there was no version of reality where this kid was mine. She was just the little fridge I'd picked up, and since Charlotte was clearly short-staffed, I figured she could just take her on as a new hire and look after her for me. Charlotte agreed that I had a point there, muttering under her breath about how a sweet kid like this had no business being related to a brute like me, and that she must have had it rough sticking around human garbage this long. She promised to look after her from now on, and asked for her name. The girl answered that she was Kana. Charlotte gave her a sly little grin at that, calling it a lovely name, then immediately asked how many cups of cold beer she could realistically pump out in a day. The moment Kana mentioned 300, Charlotte practically broke into a victory dance. Watching that unfold, I figured it was time to get back to actual work. My days tended to follow the same pattern. First came the inevitable scolding. Always some warning about not beating people up again. Then I do my rounds inspecting the fruit stalls, or that's the polite way of putting it, since I never once actually paid for anything I ate off them. After that came patrolling the market and keeping order across Cassidy City. One old man clearly resented my presence, though his wife shot him a look sharp enough to shut him up, pointing out that without me watching the streets, the old troublemakers around here would have been back stirring up chaos ages ago. Last on the list was politely collecting a small toll from certain individuals. The ones who understood that if they didn't pay up properly, they wouldn't be getting into the city at all. That was just the understood arrangement between us, given that these particular folks were smugglers, not legitimate merchants. I tossed one of them an apple afterward, telling my men to split a third of whatever we collected that day and treat themselves to drinks. That got a genuinely enthusiastic reaction out of the squad. Plenty of thanks thrown my way. Managing the outer gate and properly checking everyone coming through was technically my job, but that day, hardly anyone was trying to get into the city at all. I wondered if word had gotten around that my toll rates were too steep. Then someone appeared behind me out of nowhere, muttering in a suitably dramatic, gloomy tone that the canalia flower never withers. I asked flatly if Scar had sent him again. He immediately hushed me, warning that I shouldn't throw that name around so casually, since the man in question was the shadow of Cassidy City itself. I had no patience left for the theatrics and told him to just get to the point. He explained that a wave of unfamiliar outsiders had been slipping into the city recently, and according to their investigation, several of them were posing as merchants while behaving in ways that raised flags. He handed over a letter, personally written by the so-called Shadow King himself, claiming these people had entered 3 days earlier and never once left again, as though they were deliberately covering their tracks. The letter went on, insisting they couldn't fool him, Scar, the Shadow King, calling me his dear friend who remembered their old oath, and declaring that while he ruled over the shadows of Cassidy City, I was meant to move through the light. I crushed the thing in my fist right there, muttering that this guy was such an edgelord, as if I hadn't had enough on my plate lately without Scar sending over this kind of nonsense. I told the messenger to relay a simple message back, tell him to quit playing pretend. That earned me actual tears from the poor guy. I told him to stop with the theatrics too. More outsiders coming through generally meant a healthier economy, which honestly sounded like good news to me. Just then, a carriage rolled into view up ahead, and I nudged Sleepyhead awake beside me. Given how wealthy that carriage looked, it was time to earn our keep. The two of us moved to stop it, and I called out, asking them to pull over for the standard inspection. The man who stepped forward genuinely startled me. Shifty eyes and a face that practically screamed suspicion on sight, and I was already weighing whether to just haul him in on the spot. Sleepyhead, though, recognized him right away, explaining that this was Dolinoir, a merchant sent by the Mosaic Merchant Guild to the Cassidy branch, someone we'd apparently crossed paths with during a previous inspection. Dolinoir offered me a smooth, respectful smile, remarking that he'd half mistaken me for an actual knight, given how impressive I looked, all while quietly slipping a coin pouch and commenting on how exhausting it must be, protecting this city day and night. I gritted my teeth, honestly caught off guard that this shifty character had gone straight for the bribe. Sharp guy though, genuinely talented, and I've always had a soft spot for talent. Right about then, Sleepyhead piped up shyly, asking if Dolinoir had brought the thing from last time. He confirmed it and pulled out a bottle. I had zero clue what the two of them were on about, or what exactly was in that bottle. But judging by how tightly Sleepyhead clutched it, warning me not to even think about taking it, it clearly meant a lot to him. I just stood there, dumbfounded, reminding them both that whatever he was carrying still needed to be checked before it went through. My fingers tightened slightly as I asked if there was anything suspicious loaded into that carriage. While we talked, I caught sight of something on Dolinoir's neck, and looking closer, it turned out to be a tattoo. That's when Sleepyhead peered into the carriage and immediately recoiled in disgust, telling me I needed to see this for myself. I opened it up and froze on the spot. The whole thing was packed with dead goats, clearly not headed for any slaughterhouse given how far along the rot already was. At this rate, forget the meat, the carriage itself was going to be ruined too. I couldn't wrap my head around why anyone would haul something like this into the city in the first place. Dolinoir gave me a suitably grim look. This man really was a crooked merchant, through and through, but he'd overpaid generously and clearly knew exactly how to grease the right wheels. For the sake of my new buddy, I waved him through and even told him he was welcome back in Cassidy City anytime. Once he was out of earshot, he let out a cold little laugh to himself, muttering about how foolish everyone here was for welcoming him in so easily. After he'd gone, I turned to Sleepyhead and asked if his name had been Dolinoir, wondering out loud whether the man happened to be afraid of heights. Plenty of unfamiliar outsiders really had been pouring into Cassidy City lately, and from what the investigation turned up, a good number of them were hiding behind the merchant disguise while acting distinctly out of place. Looked like Scar had actually been onto something for once. Still, once someone stepped inside these walls, they were on my turf now. After a day spent roaming around accomplishing basically nothing, I headed to the tavern with my squad for a drink, and that's when I caught wind of something I hadn't expected. Turns out Charlotte, the prettiest woman in town by a wide margin, was actually going on a date with one of my own teammates. Cal, sitting next to me, took that news badly, muttering about how some oaf like that had somehow landed a date out of nowhere. What made it even more absurd was the location they'd apparently picked. The execution grounds. Had they somehow confused it for an amusement park? That only reinforced what I already believed, that people in this era were still hopelessly uncivilized. Brigg went on to mention he was planning to bring the bread his mother baked that day, and Cal and I both froze up at the exact same moment. Surely he didn't mean that fish head bread of hers. The mere thought alone was nauseating. Brigg looked genuinely offended, defending his family recipe as delicious, though he admitted that fish head bread was essentially baked garbage. Right then, someone walked into the tavern, launching into that same tired line about the camellia flower never withering. He didn't even get to finish it before I flattened him with a single punch. I told the others Scar wanted me for something and wished Brigg luck on his date, then headed out, dragging the messenger along behind me into a nearby alley, where Scar himself stood waiting, claiming he'd been waiting a long while, launching straight into that ridiculous oath of ours. How I ruled the light while he lurked in the shadows, the two of us supposedly governing Cassidy City together. I shot him a look sharp enough to kill and told him if he said one more word, I'd actually follow through on it. I'd barely gotten through half my meal before this idiot dragged me out here, and what exactly was going on with that ridiculous hat of his anyway? Not to mention forcing his whole crew into matching outfits and headgear. I ordered the lot of them to strip the hats off right there, and with no room to argue, they complied. I'd already told Scar countless times to knock off these childish games, since they were nothing but tedious. Still, he insisted I hear him out first, reminding me about the note from before, how outsiders pouring into Cassidy City had been behaving suspiciously, deliberately avoiding us whenever they moved around after dark. He suspected something was coming, and that we needed to tighten security ahead of it. I grabbed him by the ear and asked who exactly he thought he was. Our own guard force could handle things fine without his input. I also brought up the fact that he'd apparently stopped showing up at the carpentry workshop altogether, pointing out that his father Jason had been looking everywhere for him and asked if he genuinely didn't care. The mention of his father sent him bolting immediately, calling back over his shoulder that we'd catch up next time. Truthfully, part of what he'd said did stick with me. Something really might be brewing, so I figured it was worth staying a little more alert during the stretch. From there, I made my way to a friend's place, getting a response almost right away. The two who answered the door were old friends of mine, Darius the executioner and his son Ted. The second Ted caught sight of my gear. His eyes lit up with admiration, telling me my armor looked even sharper than before. I handed over some apples I'd picked up along the way, brought specifically for them, though I couldn't help noticing their home still carried that same hollow, quiet feel it always had. Darius waved me in to sit. I told him not to bother with the formality since the apples hadn't cost me a thing anyway, given I'd swiped them off a cart. He mentioned he'd heard that all 6 criminals headed for the execution platform this round had been caught by me personally, and genuinely seemed impressed by that. I brushed it off as mostly luck, then shifted the subject, remarking on how much Ted had grown, how fast kids seem to shoot up these days, and handed over another coin pouch, explaining that Nova had asked me to pass it along as the deposit for this commission, noting the Lord himself would be attending this time and hoping he'd bring his best work. He nodded, telling me she needn't worry about that at all. This time around, he planned to bring Ted along too, figuring it was time the boy started learning the family trade properly. A butcher's son grew up to be a butcher, so naturally, becoming an executioner someday was simply the expected path for him, something he'd take on once he came of age. Still, passing down a job the rest of the world looked down on always sat wrong with me, especially knowing Darius's own wife had eventually walked away. I told him to go ahead and eat first, that I wanted to keep talking with his father a bit longer. Eventually, the conversation drifted back to Hans. Such a shame, really. A genuinely good kid who'd turned into a criminal seemingly overnight. I joked that maybe one day I'd end up a criminal too, and when that happened, Darius would have to take my head off in a single, clean stroke. He laughed loudly, promising he'd give me his absolute best technique, that he'd never let me suffer a moment longer than necessary. Darius added smoothly that we'd all meet on the execution grounds eventually. I left with a smile on my face. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the city, another group had gathered in secret. With Scar keeping eyes on them these past few days, they'd had a hard time operating quietly, and on top of that, there'd been that whole incident outside the city recently. That pathetic failure still managed to lose. Their leader told everyone to keep their voices down, laying out the plan. In a few days, an execution would take place in the square, and that would be their one real opportunity to seize the young lady of Cassadic's heart. The others bowed their heads and answered in unison, acknowledging Lord Delanor. Someone in the back muttered a question about whether the man dozing behind them was actually asleep or already dead. At that exact moment, Sleepyhead mumbled in his sleep, begging his captain to let him rest just a little longer. Execution day rolled around. Hannah had people lining up with her little trick of chilling beer and wine with magic, and the customers were more than happy to keep the coins flowing for another round. Henna, meanwhile, was hard at work pitching her strawberry jam bread, urging everyone to pair it with a cup of wine. Vermin looked around like he genuinely couldn't figure out why he'd even been dragged into this, while Kale kept scanning the crowd for pickpockets. Henna thanked me for the idea of pairing the jam bread with wine, since it had clearly pulled in a solid crowd, and Canna's cold beer was pulling its own weight too. I figured that much made sense, though explaining the concept of marketing built on association to her would have probably gone nowhere. On top of all that, I watched more than a few of these thoroughly uncivilized townsfolk dipping their bread straight into the blood of the condemned. Henna asked, out of nowhere, why I'd taken Canna in the first place. I told her it was simple. I'd wanted a cold beer. She raised an eyebrow at that, wondering if that was really the whole story, since it wasn't like me to take an interest in anyone like that. I thought about how to put it and eventually landed on comparing it to a stray cat I'd once picked up off the street and raised. In a way, the kid reminded me of that same cat. Henna looked thoroughly unconvinced by the comparison. Right around then, Vermin wandered over, asking why we were even out here selling bread and drinks when the unit was supposedly on break. I explained we were essentially working undercover, and that he needed to flag anyone suspicious. He seemed satisfied with that answer, though he asked why it was just him, Kale, and Poole covering it today. I told him Brigg was off chatting up Charlotte as usual, and Carter was asleep somewhere. I made my way over to the prisoner cells, where I found Ted already there. I asked what he was doing in a place like this, and he explained the guests looked nervous, so he was trying to settle them down. With a calm, almost innocent sincerity, he assured them not to worry, since his father had beheaded hundreds of people by now, and would send them off without any pain at all. I patted his head and told him he really was a good kid. One of the scammers tried shouting something through his gagged mouth, and I teased him that I hadn't caught a single word of it, though it didn't much matter, since it was about time they lost their heads anyway. Darius got straight to work with his usual precision and skill, and the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of it. Watching it all unfold, it struck me that executions in this era functioned more like political theater than anything resembling justice, a way to bleed off the crowd's pent-up aggression while reminding everyone exactly who was in charge. Beyond that, Nova had already made a point of telling me this particular event carried more weight than usual. The criminals set to die today had killed a noble from Karzan, and the Lord had been actively working to build ties with that region, which made this execution something closer to a diplomatic gesture. Nothing was supposed to go wrong here, not even slightly. Of course, the moment someone insists nothing will go wrong, that's usually exactly when something does. Sure enough, I caught sight of a shadowy figure moving through the crowd. Someone who looked a lot like Doroa, right before an explosion tore through the area and sent people scattering in every direction. I knew immediately this was an attack. In the same instant, Lord Fulpitz went flying from the blast, and I couldn't resist joking that he was finally living up to that bird comparison people always made. Then the reality of it hit me. Public security during this event fell squarely on the outer fortress guard, meaning if the Lord actually died here, there was exactly one outcome waiting for us. Our own heads would be joining his in the air. Darius, remarkably, kept working through the chaos without missing a beat, and I couldn't help being impressed by that. He just smiled and told me he was simply doing what an executioner was supposed to do. Fair enough, I figured, meaning it was time I did my own job too, as captain of the guard. So I charged straight toward the explosion and the fallen lord. Nobody had seen a disaster like this coming in the middle of an execution. My squad worked to keep the crowd calm, shouting for people to stop bolting in every direction and just evacuate in an orderly line. Charlotte abandoned her stall entirely, pulling Mini Fridge into a tight hug and refusing to let go. Meanwhile, I pulled 2 kids out of the fire, asking them why they were still hanging around instead of getting clear. Then asked if they'd noticed anyone suspicious nearby, someone in a cloak maybe. That's when I spotted him up ahead, the exact person I'd been hunting, the shifty-eyed bastard from the gate. He had Lady Vivian slung in his arms. I genuinely couldn't understand why this woman kept ending up as everyone's target, but target or not, I didn't have the luxury of dwelling on it. Saving her came first. I told my squad to move, that we were bringing this criminal in, and that failing to catch him this time might cost every one of us our heads. The darkness swallowed him before we could close the gap. One of my men muttered something about jinxing it, wondering out loud if this was going to turn into another Hans situation. All that effort for nothing. Right around then, word reached us that the Lord had somehow survived. There was one more piece of news too. A knight had apparently died, caught in the blast. I couldn't help muttering, loud enough for everyone to hear, that this only confirmed what I'd always suspected about knights, unreliable through and through. Of course, the second I turned around, that comment aged badly, because standing right in front of me was a perfectly alive, perfectly unreliable knight. He didn't seem remotely bothered by what I'd just said, greeting me instead, noting it had been a while. I felt a flicker of embarrassment over my earlier comment given this was an old acquaintance. Still, I couldn't help pointing out the obvious. For a knight, he sure had a habit of ending up on the receiving end of every fight he showed up to. Ben admitted he let his guard down, explaining the criminal behind all this was a black mage. Then, dropping his voice, he warned me that there was a traitor hiding among our own soldiers and that I needed to watch my back. That froze me on the spot. Before I could process it fully, a scream cut through the chaos, one I recognized instantly as Kai's. Kai was in trouble, facing off against a small blue figure, howling in what looked like agonizing pain. The little blue demon across from him seemed genuinely baffled by the reaction, pointing out he'd only landed one punch and hadn't even hit that hard, wondering if Kai wasn't overreacting just a bit. In truth, Kai was perfectly fine, just stalling for time. That only irritated the thing further, since it had no idea what Kai was even talking about. A second later, a booming crash rang out. I'd already closed in and had the little blue demon gripped tightly by the throat. I asked it, half amused, if that scream I'd heard earlier had been its doing. Trapped in my grip, the demon couldn't so much as struggle, silently cursing me as some kind of monster. I found myself genuinely confused, too, wondering how something this weak had ever worked up the nerve to attack a place like this in the first place. Right as it was on the verge of passing out, I let go. It clearly posed no real threat to me, and I preferred having an actual conversation with it instead. I told it plainly that it now understood exactly what I was capable of, and that if it didn't want to repeat performance, it had better come clean with everything. That was all it took. The little demon started talking a mile a minute, revealing that the black mage was the true mastermind behind all of this. Someone after the young lady's heart specifically. One of my men laughed beside me, remarking on how quickly this thing's survival instincts had kicked in, surprisingly forthcoming once properly motivated. As it kept rambling, I decided I'd heard plenty. This one was just a low-level contractor bound to the maid, nothing more, with no real insight into why the black mage actually wanted the young lady's heart in the first place. I waved a hand and told my men to haul it off, figuring it had earned a pass this time given how cooperative it had been. The little demon practically glowed with gratitude. My squad mate chatted with it good-naturedly as they led it away. Based on what we pieced together, this new contact of mine was tangled up with the black mage, who was apparently running demons like personal foot soldiers. Still unclear was what exactly the young lady had to do with any of it, or why her heart specifically mattered so much. That's when someone called out to me from behind, addressing me as captain, having finally tracked me down. It was Sleepyhead. I asked if he'd only just woken up, warning him that sleeping this much wasn't normal anymore. He started walking toward me, talking about how painful it was, not being able to sleep properly, how being that sleep-deprived left you feeling like you were never truly awake even with your eyes open, wandering through some kind of permanent haze, everything blurred at the edges. As he spoke, he'd already slipped a dagger out from behind his back. His expression shifted the instant before he struck, and I reacted on pure instinct, drawing my sword just in time to block him. Sleepyhead stared back at me, cold and unfamiliar, and told me good night. Back when he was young, famine had torn through his village, leaving people with nothing to eat but tree roots. And if someone got lucky, maybe a rat or a cockroach they'd choke down raw. Carter had no choice but to go hungry right alongside his family and his little brother. Then one day, meat finally showed up on the table, and his family devoured it after going without for so long. His younger brother, though, was nowhere to be found, having grown sicker and weaker by the day, unable to pull his weight anymore. The meat that night had been him. Ever since, Carter hadn't managed a real night's sleep, haunted by the same question over and over. Would they eat without him next time? Did anyone even realize how much that thought tortured him? I blocked his strike, telling him I'd already heard that story, calling him garbage for it as I slashed upward, forcing him to scramble back a step. He asked what I thought now. Wasn't he strong? All thanks to finally sleeping properly for once, courtesy of that candy Dorno had given him. That told me everything. Powers pulled straight from a demon's gift, and clearly his strength and speed had jumped considerably because of it. Watching him move, it was obvious he had raw talent for fighting, something he'd never actually trained. Grinning as I let him close the distance before sidestepping at the last second, his sword driving straight into the wall instead, more a product of his inexperience than any real skill on his part. That only made him angrier, and he summoned his demonic power into his left fist, swinging for a killing blow. I ducked under it without much trouble, telling him I understood, that I struggled with sleep plenty myself, and that I forgave him for it. Then I drove my blade straight through his chest, ending it, hoping he could forgive me in return. For the first time in what felt like forever, Carter's mind drifted back to his little brother's face, and he smiled, murmuring that he was finally getting sleepy, and I told him to sleep tight, promising him the best lullaby I had left to give. A handful of other knights lay dead nearby, close to a narrow gap leading outside the city walls. Dorno stood there catching his breath, grumbling about how persistent these night guards were, having had to squeeze through a cramped tunnel just to get this far. Still, it had been worth it, since he finally had his hands on the one favored by mana, and all that was left was carving out this human's heart to claim its power for himself. That's when I called out, letting him know I'd found him after all. How exactly had he tracked down that tunnel, I wondered? Had Carter told him about it? Maybe we should have a quick chat to sort out what to do with him. Doroa looked genuinely confused, having assumed Knight was on his tail, only to find some green captain of the guard standing there instead. He conjured a swarm of dark shadows and hurled them my way. I cut through the snake-shaped one easily enough, but the wolf-shaped shadow moved faster than expected and managed to sink its teeth into my forearm before I finally severed it. Watching the wound, I could see some kind of vile curse creeping into my skin from the bite, my whole body growing heavier, every movement more painful than the last. If this dragged on much longer, the disadvantage would only grow. Doroa looked mildly surprised that I was still standing, but could I really hold my own against Lord Quentel's Shadow Legion? I couldn't help wondering what kind of ridiculous name that was. That comment clearly rattled him, and he sent even more shadows my way. I figured that if I wanted to play by the rules, I'd need to take him alive, but given that he'd betrayed one of his own men and sold them off to a demon, that courtesy was off the table. I charged straight in, telling him a sentence was immediate execution and that I'd be the one carrying it out. One strike took down the venomous snake, and I made short work of the giant bird and wolf right after, though all three turned out to be nothing more than illusions spun from demonic energy. His expression soured the moment that registered, clearly baffled that a mere guard captain could hold his own like this. With no other option left, he unleashed what looked like his strongest move, chanting something about how those who carried the weight of punishment would be judged as sinners, raising both hands to bury me under a wave of demonic energy. Small demons started crawling up from beneath my feet, wrapping themselves around my arms and swelling into full form within seconds. He gloated that a mere guard captain had no business standing against a triple curse that even knights struggled to shake off. I didn't take any of it seriously. A moment later, he stood there in complete shock, watching every one of those demons fall apart under my blade. I told him my hearing wasn't what it used to be, and asked him to repeat whatever he just said. He clearly lost all appetite for repeating himself after that, reaching into his pocket instead, snapping that he wouldn't tolerate my attitude any longer. A second later, he cracked open a small bottle, revealing a severed finger inside, and the instant it hit the ground, That finger started twitching on its own. I found that oddly fascinating. Was he actually summoning a demon using a bishop's severed finger? Whatever it was let out a roar, its tail slamming down hard enough to crater the ground. Doanor burst out laughing, mocking the idea of some lowly guard captain acting tough in front of him, but by then I was already closing the distance at full speed, power building steadily in my hand. I brought my sword down against the thing's teeth, only to find the strike did absolutely nothing, meaning ordinary tactics clearly weren't going to cut it here. So I took a breath, filled my lungs, and dove straight into the demon's open mouth. It swallowed me whole in one loud gulp. Doanor lost it laughing at that, genuinely baffled that anyone could be stupid enough to leap willingly into a demon's throat. I didn't see what was so funny, honestly, since, as far as I was concerned, I just successfully got myself inside the thing. I gave it a light tap on the chest from within, telling whatever was in there to hurry up and show itself. Sure enough, the eye I recognized appeared right behind me, asking if I'd come looking for it. Good, that meant this would be easy. It had gone quiet ever since the last time it lent me that power, and I figured it was due for another handout. It smiled at that, telling me I really hadn't changed, though that was apparently part of what made this fun. As it spoke, it wrapped a glow of holy power around my sword, agreeing to lend me its strength. On one condition, I gave it a look, waiting to hear it. It told me I wasn't allowed to breathe a word to any other demons about the fact that it could channel holy power, or it would never help me again. Right then, my sword lit up and I felt it clearly, that same electric tingle running through my whole body. Holy power, unmistakably. I started tearing into the demon from the inside, swinging wildly, and after several strikes, its body was shredded from every angle. Outside, Doanor had no clue what was happening, unable to make sense of how a guard captain had somehow gotten his hands on power exclusive to knights. A thought crossed his mind, wondering if I might actually be a knight myself, demanding to know if the royal family had sent me, insisting he'd never received word of any such plan. I told him if he wanted to know who I really was. A heartbeat later, I took his head clean off. A few drops of his blood landed on my neck. Dead as he was, I still gave him the courtesy of my cover story. With him finally handled, things went quiet. I sheathed my sword, satisfied that I'd settled the score for Sleepyhead, since Delan Noir was the one who'd corrupted him in the first place. But just as I turned to leave, traces of magic started leaking out of his severed head, a magic circle forming beneath it and lifting it into the air. I spun around, caught off guard, recognizing the spell instantly as one that only triggered after death. Of course, something this troublesome would show up right when I thought it was over. All I wanted was to grab Lady Vivian and get out of there. The next instant, a pillar of purple flame erupted skyward and sent me flying. At least I'd already gotten Vivian to safety before that hit. But now I was staring down the most dangerous thing I'd faced all night. Something massive had risen up behind me, two horns jutting from its head. All I could do at that point was scoop up the young lady and run as fast as my legs would carry us. The demon slammed one foot down and the ground shook beneath it. Clutching my head, more out of sheer annoyance than fear, I grabbed my sword and grumbled that somebody had better bail me out after making me pull this kind of overtime. That's when the shouting started, one of two figures nearby screaming Vivian's name, demanding to know where she was while handling the demon with a level of ease that made it obvious they knew what they were doing. I ducked behind a tree and got a look at them. A knight and an inquisitor working together. Vivian stirred groggily right around then, mumbling something about who I even was in her half-asleep haze. Before she could fully come to, I knocked her straight back out, though I did wonder for a second if I'd hit her a little too hard, given the state she was in. Covering her face with a handkerchief I'd swiped off Kale seemed like the responsible move. With that handled, I slipped away, figuring the guard captain's shift was officially over for the night. The knight and inquisitor eventually finished off the demon between them. The knight kept asking about Vivian's whereabouts, until the inquisitor pointed toward a clearing where someone was lying on the ground, unmistakably her. They rushed over, checking that she was breathing, relieved to find her alive, though the state she was in raised an obvious question. Had someone actually knocked her unconscious? Afterward, the whole unit regrouped back at the inn. One of the guys, thoroughly fed up, complained about how we were ever supposed to beat a dark mage under these conditions, grumbling that if that had been the plan, they should have handled the inspections themselves from the start. I gave Kana a light pat on the head, remarking that it had already been a full week since the Dark Mage's attack. The Lord, who'd gone airborne like some kind of unwilling bird, had come through completely unscathed, and his daughter Vivian had made it back alive too, so the whole affair was officially considered resolved. Thanks to some carefully arranged false testimony, Carter's death got recorded as a heroic loss in battle against a demon. which meant his family walked away with proper compensation for his sacrifice. Kale still couldn't wrap his head around the idea of Carter charging a demon without a shred of fear. Paul figured Carter's old wish had finally come true, that he'd sleep peacefully now, forever. Brigg admitted he planned to hold on to that courage Carter had shown, charging in without hesitation. I raised my cup, offering one last toast to Carter, whose sword now sat resting on the chair he used to occupy, a man who'd held on to his honor as a guard right up to the end, even if the choice he'd made with that demon had cost him his honor as a human. Berman mentioned hearing that a new recruit was coming in to fill Carter's spot. I figured whoever it was would probably show up eventually. No rush. Turned out that man had zero patience, bursting straight into the tavern before I'd even finished the thought. None other than Dylan, freshly assigned Outer Fortress Guard Unit 4, delivering the most enthusiastic greeting imaginable. Everyone just stared at him in silence, quietly wishing Carter could somehow come back instead. Even Dylan seemed to sense he might be laying it on a little thick. He clearly hadn't expected his connection to me to stretch this far into an actual working relationship. Paul admitted the guy seemed to genuinely admire me, and Brigg pointed out the two of us weren't all that different. Dylan, naturally, wasted no time bringing up how he'd once helped me survive an onslaught of thousands of zombies, insisting I would have died without him there. Kale groaned at the thought of having to sit through that story on a daily basis from now on. I found myself wondering how someone this ridiculous had ever gotten recruited into our unit, and Hannah pointed out flatly that I'd said that thought out loud instead of keeping it in my head. She slammed a cup down in front of Dylan, gave him a long, unreadable stare, then turned away without another word. Dylan called after her to wait a second. She turned only her head, asking sharply what he wanted. He fumbled over his words for a moment before bowing and apologizing for how he'd acted the day they first met, explaining it was practically tradition among mercenaries, that he'd only been trying to fit in with the crowd. Hannah studied him a beat longer before sighing and telling him it was fine, then promptly pulled out a crossbow and aimed it straight at his head, adding that dealing with idiots like him was basically part of her daily routine at this point. But if he ever pulled that stunt again, she'd put a hole clean through his skull. I watched the whole exchange with quiet amusement, since Henna had never once been someone you could push around easily. I called Dylan over and handed him Carter's old sword, telling him that from this moment on, he was officially a member of Outer Fortress Guard Unit 4, and that he'd better work hard because the alternative was dying out here. He stood there frozen for a moment before breaking down, saluting through tears and swearing he'd give it everything he had. Dylan settled into Unit 4 amid what passed for a warm welcome around here, and looking back on that day much later, only one thought ever crossed his mind. He really should have made a run for it while he still had the chance. That day, I brought Dylan along to see how the job actually worked. My routine was simple enough, shaking down anyone who broke the entry rules. Dylan watched with pure disbelief as every traveler passing through handed over a hefty pile of silver without much fuss. I explained the logic to him that with a demon incident so fresh in everyone's memory, inspections had to be strict, obviously. Dylan looked stunned. Realizing we weren't just squeezing coachmen for silver, we were also casually roughing people up under the excuse of screening for demon possession, so this was guard work. He was thoroughly impressed, and it turned out he had a natural gift for it too. No training required. At this rate, coins would practically fall into my pocket without me lifting a finger, which honestly wasn't a bad arrangement. Then I caught someone talking in a distinctly hostile tone nearby, seemingly aimed at Dylan, demanding to know who he thought he was, mouthing off without knowing his place. Dylan, oblivious to how serious this actually was, waved it off, telling the man he didn't care who he was, and to hand over the silver already. The second he finished that sentence, I grabbed him by the neck and asked if he had some kind of death wish, tossing him aside and quickly assuring the man that this was just a rookie who had no idea what he was doing, first day and all. But when I actually looked inside the carriage, and to my surprise, there wasn't a single noble in there. I switched gears immediately, explaining that following the recent demon incident, the Lord had personally ordered a thorough inspection of every traveler passing through the gates, and that Dylan's behavior reflected poorly on the authority of Cassidy City's Lord himself. That shift in tone clearly caught the man off guard. Dylan snapped back to life instantly, echoing my new line, demanding again that the clueless fool hand over the silver, having apparently heard nothing of what his boss had just said. Their leader hadn't expected me to flip my attitude that fast once he realized there were no nobles present, and with no better option, he handed the silver over, insisting that wasn't what he'd meant earlier. With that little shakedown wrapped up, there was still one more thing to handle. I spun around and cracked Dylan across the back of the head, reminding him loudly, for the soldier's benefit, that the Lord had specifically ordered these checks to screen for demon possession, then wished the group a safe journey on their way. The man was furious by then, convinced this had all been deliberate, silently vowing that he'd make the two of us regret every coin we'd taken. Afternoon rolled around, and Kai called me over again, mentioning someone from the church was asking for me. I had no idea what this was about this time, wondering why church officials kept tracking me down every few days. Given the demon riding around inside my chest, had they finally figured out what I was hiding and decided it was time to deal with me? The heresy inquisitor threw the door open right then, scaring the hell out of me on the spot. Thankfully, the priest standing behind her just laughed, greeting me warmly, saying I'd finally shown up. That entrance alone had rattled me badly. She mentioned she'd witnessed my fight against the demon firsthand, praising how I'd rescued the young lady from it. I tensed up immediately, worried she'd caught on to the demonic power I'd used in the process. As it turned out, the priest had actually called me over to hand out a reward, having prepared a small gift for the occasion. I perked up at that, hoping it might be another payout like before. This time, though, there was no gold waiting for me. Instead, the priest wrapped a scarf around my neck, beaming as he declared me an honorary monk. Not exactly the reward I'd been hoping for. If given the choice, I would have taken another pile of coins any day. What I hadn't seen coming was that the priest had one more request tucked away, asking me to give the heresy inquisitor a personal tour of Cassidy City. The moment he said it, he slipped away without so much as a backward glance, clearly having only invited me over to dump this errand on me. One of these days, I was going to make him regret that. I turned back to the Inquisitor, thoroughly unenthusiastic about the assignment, well aware that if she ever discovered the demon inside me, a mace to the skull would be the least of my worries. So I asked if she was hungry, mentioning a restaurant I frequented, and led her straight to the fish head bread shop. If there was any way to make her rethink this whole outing, this was it. That particular dish happened to be my teammate's mother's signature specialty. One bite in, though, and the Inquisitor's expression collapsed into something between horror and betrayal, which had me barely holding back laughter. I couldn't help it, given I was walking around possessed by a demon and stuck babysitting a heresy inquisitor of all people. That laughter didn't last, though, because the next second she fixed me with a look sharp enough to cut glass, asking flatly if I intended to eat mine or not. I blurted out that of course I was, and the two of us powered through the rest together, both silently agreeing that the only way to survive this spread was to finish it in one continuous push. We barely made it through. That taste was pure torture, and I had to hand it to her. Right as we finished, the shop owner cheerfully asked if we wanted a second helping. The Inquisitor bolted straight for the door, genuinely one of the more impressive standoffs I'd witnessed. To my dismay, though, the woman running the shop set another loaf down in front of me anyway, explaining she'd noticed how much we seemed to enjoy it and worried one round wouldn't be enough, so she'd whipped up a second batch on the house this time. Staring down at that bread, I decided I'd honestly rather take a mace to the skull. Later, when my squad mates caught sight of me, one of them just sighed, remarking that things kept getting more absurd by the day. My outfit had gotten noticeably fancier lately, and I'd stumbled onto a genuine perk of the whole honorary monk gig. Half the shops in town started giving me discounts the moment they spotted the cloak. Kai, standing beside me, looked deeply troubled by the whole development, muttering that if the captain had become an honorary monk, the empire itself was clearly doomed. He added that the Lord had sent some people over to smooth things out with us, and somehow that had ended in a clash instead, meaning the punishment coming our way might end up worse than expected. No sooner had he finished than someone came storming in, shouting something about a clueless bunch of guard bastards. Perfect timing, really. I couldn't help pointing out that if it was entirely one-sided, did it even count as a real fight? The coachman couldn't have cared less about any special orders. I started counting to 3, and Kale immediately started screaming that as an honorary monk, I really shouldn't be causing a scene like this. I agreed, honorary monk and all, but the coachman just took that as an opportunity to needle me further, poking at my head, asking if I'd gotten scared meeting him like this, insisting I should remember my place as a mere guard. That was enough. I hit 3 and drove my fist into him hard enough to send him skidding across the ground before slamming into a wall. This wasn't really a fight at that point. More a case of me defending myself against a one-sided assault I hadn't asked for. Kale pointed out that framing it as a one-sided assault actually made the whole thing a bigger legal headache, but I waved him off, reminding him I was an honorary monk, so it was fine. A while later, the coachman came to, sporting an impressive bruise across his face. Kale checked in with him near the fortress gate, and Galeheim, once he gathered himself, marveled at how strong that man clearly was, remarking he had no business working as a mere guard captain, that someone with that kind of power belonged as a private soldier for some noble house. Not that he was implying I was weak or anything. Kale muttered that this guy was clearly just rambling excuses at this point, then introduced himself properly, with the coachman offering his own name in turn, Gelheim of the Fenner family apologizing for how he'd acted while drunk. Still, the question remained, what exactly had this man been doing before that? smacking random strangers around. Kale explained that, according to him, this was supposedly a technique for identifying demons, though it looked a lot more like stress relief in practice. Then, out of nowhere, the demon lodged inside the man I just knocked out stirred awake, demanding to know how some puny human had dared to strike it. Galheim looked stunned that the method had actually worked. Kyle was just as floored. I might have been the most surprised of all, given I'd genuinely just been hitting people at random with no real expectation behind it. Thankfully, the demon I'd stumbled onto turned out to be nothing more than some low-level lackey. Still, the fact that another demon had surfaced barely a week after the last incident sent the fortress into another round of chaos. That day, I watched Kassertik's strongest gather in one place, with the Inquisitor dispatching the demon in such a brutally efficient manner that I almost found myself feeling sorry for the poor thing. By the time I made it home, Dylan greeted me with a bright grin, broom in hand, thrilled I was back, having apparently worked hard all day and asking if I wanted a bath first or dinner. Before he could finish, I cut in, asking what exactly he was even doing here. Henna shouted at him to get back to sweeping, explaining to me that Dylan had kept coming by to apologize repeatedly, so she decided to put all that guilt to good use and let him help around the place. She'd been swamped lately, mostly thanks to how well Canna's cold beer was selling. I grabbed my own mug and drank deep, thinking that flavor alone was bound to keep sales climbing. Beer really was best served ice cold. Watching Canna work, it occurred to me that a mage with her ability was being wasted purely as a walking fridge. Real magic books were expensive and hard to come by, but maybe it was time I started investing in actually developing her further. Meanwhile, out on the road just past Kassertik, another wagon rolled along, two visibly reluctant men steering it up front. A voice from inside complained about how badly the carriage was shaking, warning that they'd be dead the instant something went wrong before reaching the fortress. The man muttering that curse resented having to trek all the way out to some backwater county just to track down a single person, chalking it up to their boss's chronic inability to let go of anything he'd once gotten his hands on. The one riding beside him reminded him that their boss's word was law, and everyone, especially him given his loose mouth, needed to keep quiet and stay composed. He laughed that off easily enough. A child riding along called out for Levi. The two drivers had only agreed to let their passengers on board because of clear threats, and one of them couldn't help wondering if getting caught during inspection because of these people would put the rest of them at risk too. Libby reassured Furus it would be fine, since Hedrick Forest checkpoint only pretended to run thorough inspections and would wave anyone through the moment a silver coin changed hands. Once they made it inside the fortress, they'd be safe regardless, so the plan was simple: drop these passengers off and clear out as fast as possible. As they pulled up to the gate, Paul, stationed there at the time, recognized Libby immediately, remarking it had been a while, half a year or so since Libby's last run-through as a peddler. Libby returned the greeting, mentioning he'd been laid up recently with a fever. He looked genuinely surprised, though, spotting 5 guards on duty instead of the usual 2, muttering it was at least fortunate the guard captain wasn't among them. He thanked Paul for his hard work and slipped him the usual silver coin. Paul thanked him back, waving him through. That's when Dylan's voice cut in, telling him to hold on. With 3 extra guards on duty now, that meant more coin to go around for everyone. Paul insisted the amount already offered was reasonable, but Libby quickly started backpedaling, offering more if needed, clearly desperate not to let whatever was hiding behind him get discovered, determined to get everyone safely inside no matter the cost. At the same time, Kale walked alongside me, asking if I'd heard the news. Ever since that last successful demon catch, the commander had overhauled the inspection process entirely, requiring everyone riding in a carriage to step out and undergo individual checks. If even one person looked remotely suspicious, the guards now had permission to work them over with a bat, which was exactly what Dylan was doing at that very moment. Much to Libby's visible dismay, Jacob came charging in with his sword drawn, demanding to know what kind of inspection method involved beating someone with a wooden bat. Honestly, I found myself wondering the same thing: why they'd bothered upgrading to a bat when just using a hand had worked fine before. Dylan, undeterred, started shouting that these people were demons, and the guards immediately set upon them, cutting them down one by one. Jacob, feeling his life slip away, glanced over and noticed that Jake beside him had only fainted, figuring things might still work out somehow. I already knew this checkpoint system was only going to spiral into more chaos from here, and announced I was heading out, since it was time to upgrade my little fridge into something closer to a multi-tool. As Kanna watched me enjoy my drink, I called her over and gave her what I considered a warm smile, patting her head and asking exactly what kind of magic she could currently pull off. Sheepishly, she listed off magic dice cooling things down and some basic clairvoyance. That threw me a little. Had she picked up magic from some gambling addict, of all people? She explained the man who taught her had described himself as someone who understood romance. I concluded she'd apparently been destined from birth to learn magic from a loser. Still, I wondered if someone like her could genuinely pick up new spells from books alone. She insisted, quite firmly, that she'd always been a fast learner, good at anything she set her mind to. Henna had apparently mentioned she was even good at washing dishes. That reminded me of an old comrade of mine, someone I'd once asked how he'd learned magic in the first place. He told me flatly that he hadn't had the brains for it, so there was no point asking him anything, that he'd simply been desperate and somehow ended up sharper than everyone around him anyway. A genuine prodigy in the end. Kanna begged me not to abandon her right then, and I told her that kind of talk made things sound far more dramatic than they needed to be, likely to give people the wrong idea. Regardless, if she was serious about learning, I wanted to hear it plainly. She agreed instantly, promising to follow any order I gave. Something about her reminded me faintly of a certain weasel I knew well. Kanna mentioned there was actually something she hadn't told me yet. But before she could get it out, Dylan came crashing through the tavern door, calling out that we had a serious problem on our hands. All the prisoners we captured during the inspection had broken loose, one of them having chewed clean through his wooden shackles and bolted without a second thought, then gone on to fight off armed guards barehanded. The very same man Dylan himself had originally subdued and knocked unconscious. He asked what we should do. Honestly, I told him, whatever happened to that guy wasn't really my concern. Still, Dylan had come because the guard captain had ordered everyone to assemble at headquarters immediately. I sighed and told Henna to keep the doors locked given how dangerous the streets had gotten, suggesting she use her clairvoyance to keep watch for anyone knocking. Dylan wished me a safe trip, only for me to grab him by the ear and drag him along, reminding him he was part of the unit too, storm or no storm. The guard captain, once we'd all gathered on that stormy night, called us a bunch of absolute fools for letting the prisoners escape in the first place. One of the other guards pointed out this was exactly why they'd suggested switching from wooden shackles to iron ones. The captain snapped back, asking how he dared talk back, and pointing out that a single iron shackle cost as much as 50 wooden ones, a wildly poor return on investment. I pointed out that, as ridiculous as it sounded, the wooden shackles had actually done their job just fine, and the fact that everyone had escaped together suggested there was something more coordinated going on here. Another guard captain mentioned he'd already looked into the first man to break out, discovering he was a professional fixer out of Tarzan, apparently well known there for taking on jobs for a price. That surprised me, honestly, that Dylan had managed to catch someone with that kind of reputation, which explained why he'd looked so rattled earlier. Right then, Furus burst into the room asking who the guard in charge was, pointing at me and calling me the scary muscled one. I bristled a little at how he addressed his elders, but let him explain himself once he'd calmed down. He pleaded that their teacher hadn't done anything wrong and needed saving. Another guard captain filled in the gap, explaining that the man who'd smuggled the fixer inside was Levy, the coachman who occasionally passed through to trade. Furus confirmed they'd all been threatened into cooperating. Elsewhere, the escaped prisoners paused to catch their breath, one grumbling about how persistent these guards were proving to be. Levy dragged along with them despite never having planned an escape himself. One of the men muttered how terrifying it was that the guards had actually started cracking heads open right at inspection, another adding that they must already have a reputation, since getting hit in the head like that meant you weren't even being treated as human anymore. The sound of approaching footsteps sent them scrambling in the opposite direction. The Levy quickly recognized what was happening, that they were being deliberately herded, and they braced to attack, only for me to grab the lead man and drive him straight into the pavement, freezing everyone else in place. Levy recognized me instantly as the same brutal figure who'd torn through Dylan's arrest earlier. One of the mercenaries snatched up a stick and swung for my head, but I blocked it easily and started working him over too. Levy could hardly believe he was crossing paths with this particular devil of a man, while breaking out of custody of all things. He dropped to the ground, begging for mercy, but I just grabbed him and asked what exactly he was screaming about. I asked why he'd bothered escaping in the first place, causing this whole mess, then pointed out that his student was looking for him, tilting my head toward Furus. The moment Levy spotted him, he pulled the boy into a tight embrace, momentarily forgetting the storm raging around them entirely. My methods tend to run rough and foul-mouthed, occasionally swinging fists for no clear reason at all. But that doesn't necessarily make me someone worth judging purely on the surface of my actions. I asked the other guard captain if he tracked down which direction the fixer had gone, and learned he was holed up somewhere in District 5, the exact stretch where the Laughing Rabbit Inn sat. Sure enough, the fixer was standing right outside the inn when we arrived. Before I could act, I sidestepped a strike aimed at my head, courtesy of Poole, with Dylan shouting that this was our man. that we should beat him senseless. Scar stepped in front of them right then, declaring he couldn't stand by and watch a criminal wander freely through his territory without his express permission. He lunged again, only for the fixer to dodge and slice at him and the other two in one smooth motion, clearly registering just how dangerous this man actually was. The fixer straightened, asking if anyone had seen a girl passing through. Purple-haired, easy to spot. A second later, one of my own men jumped into the fight. The fixer threw a punch, somehow spinning a full circle in midair, and landed a clean hit even after the flip. Realizing how badly this was going, my teammate immediately told Dylan to run. Dylan bolted at full speed, convinced that even three of them together couldn't take this man down, that the whole situation was hopeless. He apologized inwardly to Poole, admitting that even though Poole had treated a third-rate mercenary like him as family, this time, he genuinely couldn't listen and back off, so just as the fixer moved in to finish Poole off, Dylan shouted from behind, taunting him about how badly he'd once beaten him, how his own brother had ended up carved into human skewers thanks to him. Honestly, a pretty sharp move on Dylan's part. It worked instantly, sending the fixer into a rage right as the sword tip closed in on Dylan's skull. A spray of rainwater kicked up into the air a heartbeat later, and a fist the size of a boulder crashed straight into the fixer's face, sending him flying from the sheer force of it. Somehow, Dylan really was frustratingly hard to kill. I stared him down with something closer to murder in my eyes, though. Dylan froze completely, opting to just lie there on the ground and play dead. I couldn't help but shake my head at that. The fixer dusted himself off, seemingly unbothered by the punch, like it hadn't done much damage at all. I let out a laugh, pointing out that this was apparently the weak little shrimp who'd gotten dropped by my own underling earlier, and asked if getting beaten by him had really warranted rolling around in the dirt like that too. The second he turned to check, I struck. That earned a genuinely stunned reaction out of him, remarking that someone with my level of strength resorting to such a cheap shot felt beneath me. I told him to take the compliment where he could get it, calling him naive, then buried my boot into his stomach before grabbing his collar and slamming him repeatedly into the ground like a rag doll. Even after all that, the man proved genuinely tough to put down. I couldn't quite square how someone at his level had ever gotten taken out by Dylan in the first place, or what had brought him all the way out to a backwater place like this. He admitted he was searching for someone, then asked if I'd happened to see a short girl with purple hair. That clicked immediately. He had to mean Mini Fridge. I remembered the people who'd controlled Canna before had also come from Mount Collier, meaning there was likely a connection running through all of this. Sending an actual fixer just to retrieve one shabby little mage seemed absurdly excessive. The fixer's expression darkened, noting that I clearly knew who he was talking about, telling me to bring him to her quietly, and he'd let this whole confrontation drop. The moment he finished that sentence, though, a sharp pain tore through him, courtesy of Dylan, who'd driven a sword straight through his chest from behind. Dylan shouted that this bastard had no business having dirty thoughts about that purple-haired girl. The fixer clearly hadn't expected to die here, let alone at the hands of the same man who'd already subdued him once before. By that point, I was thoroughly worn out, having barely slept the entire day, wanting nothing more than a cold beer to soothe my throat. The next day, Dylan couldn't stop bragging about the fight, describing it with the kind of pride you'd expect, going on about how the stupid giant bald egg hadn't stood a chance against the two of us, how once I'd joined in, he'd driven his sword straight to the man's chest. I stopped by to visit Poole around then, bringing along a gift for the patient, his favorite fish head bread. Dylan looked at it in horror, asking if I genuinely brought the murder bread with me. The bandaged man beside them mentioned somewhat awkwardly that he'd noticed I'd bought 3 loaves, though he happened to be fasting and couldn't partake. The mood in the room turned distinctly uncomfortable at that. Poole finally piped up, telling their squad leader it was only fair he eat one too. Back at the inn, the place was as lively as ever. That red-haired kid sauntered over to Mini Fridge, complimenting how beautiful she looked, but the second she spotted me walking in, she abandoned him entirely and rushed to my side instead, handing me a mug of beer, exactly what I needed after the day I'd had. I asked her, out of genuine curiosity, if she had any real goals for herself, whether she pictured becoming a knight, a noblewoman, anything like that down the road. She hesitated for a moment before admitting that all she really wanted was to survive. That answer caught me off guard more than I expected, though I could tell she wasn't exaggerating in the slightest. I told her that was fine, that I'd keep working hard on my end, and that meant she needed to hold up her side of that too. With that, I wandered off to catch up with Charlotte. Mini Fridge just stood there afterward, looking faintly puzzled. Then it clicked for her, remembering something Dylan had told her earlier. that if any boy ever tried inviting her out for juice sometime, the correct response was to crack him hard across the back of the head. The following day, looking to pick up some low-quality potions from the cellar there, he waved that idea off entirely, telling me high-quality stock was out of the question and that even the low-quality potions were running out. So I'd be paying 90 silver a bottle, take it or get lost. I stood there, biting back the urge to hit him. Right then, another monk stepped in, questioning why Cathap was quoting me the regular price at all. This new arrival was clearly another honorary monk himself, and apparently both Priest Bion and the Inquisitor had personally requested and appointed him at the church. Cathap grumbled that the whole honorary monk business wasn't remotely funny, but relented anyway, dropping the price to 50 silver per potion. That floored me, nearly half off. Was this some kind of holy price-fixing cartel? As I walked off with Ein, I thanked him for getting me such a deal. He brushed it off, calling it simply the kind of authority that came with his position, and asked that I be understanding of Cathap's attitude given the abbot was apparently due to visit Casterdic Fortress soon, keeping everyone scrambling with preparations. Ein mentioned he had matters to attend to and wished me a safe walk home. It struck me, watching him go, that there were actually a few reasonable people within the church after all. Up until then, I'd only really encountered people like Priest Bion or the Inquisitor, who I caught out of the corner of my eye, devouring an entire pound cake by herself. I wondered what she was even doing hanging around instead of heading back. The moment she spotted me though, she rushed over, smiling gently as she handed me a slice, sighed, and turned to leave again. I ate it, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that woman was anything but ordinary. Back at the guard commander's office, every unit leader had been summoned. He informed us the peace officer was furious, and even though the fault clearly sat with the Fenner family rather than us, we still had to fall in line, meaning no days off for the entire coming month. The other unit leaders practically crumbled at that news, insisting there had to be limits to how unreasonable one person could be. The man beside me and I, though, didn't react quite as strongly, since none of this was really the commander's fault to begin with. Still, an entire month without rest was rough by any measure. He mentioned hearing that the eldest son of the Fenner family was due to visit soon, and I asked if he meant the one who trained as a knight candidate. He confirmed it, someone who'd graduated from the Imperial Institution but never actually earned knighthood. I couldn't help thinking the pile of complications just kept growing. The abbot coming down from the church, and now the Fenner heir on top of it. Trouble seemed to arrive in clusters lately. The guard captain came over to remind me that Nova had been trying to reach me, something I'd completely forgotten about. She greeted me with an unusually long smile and introduced something that genuinely rewired my brain a little. A door. Apparently, opening one created a passage people could actually walk through, letting them move in and out of buildings without incident. All you had to do was grip the handle and push. I asked why she was bothering to show me this, and that's when she snapped, demanding to know why I never used doors at all, instead just smashing my way through everything. Asking if I had any idea how many walls I'd destroyed in the past month alone. I told her plainly that I hadn't had much choice in the matter, that I clearly wasn't the type who tore down walls for fun. She softened slightly, informing me the repair costs for the walls I destroyed would be deducted straight from my bounty rewards. There'd been a decent stash of bounty money saved up from everyone I'd caught, and after the deduction, all that remained was a single silver coin. I looked at it, then tossed it right back to her, calling it a tip, telling her to go treat herself to something nice, and asking if she knew that sitting cooped up indoors all day caused bone problems. Still, I promised her I'd use the door properly this time. As I walked off, one of my fellow guards asked if Nova had chewed me out again. I admitted it had gone something like that, but told him it was over now. Time to get back to patrolling. Inspections were fun in their own way, legally squeezing coin out of travelers, but patrolling had its own charm too, since medieval folks managed to cause chaos on a near-daily basis without fail. Sure enough, we stumbled onto a scuffle. I stepped in and told them to settle down, adding that whoever won the fight was obviously in the right. Kale and I settled in to watch it play out, with Kale putting a silver coin on the smaller guy taking the win. Further along, we passed a pack of kids who scattered, shouting warnings to each other that I'd eat them alive if I caught them mid-game. I ignored the theatrics entirely, noting how peaceful the day had been so far. Right on cue, a commotion broke out. A woman demanding answers from 3 people about who had taken her silverware. Kale stepped in to ask what the trouble was. She said the timing couldn't be better, insisting we come take a look, since one of these 3 had stolen silverware that had been passed down through her family for generations. One of them, looking barely human, denied it outright, questioning who would even bother stealing rusty old silverware in the first place. Another woman, with visibly crooked teeth, denied it just as firmly, pointing out she already owned a silver mirror at home, so why would she need something like that? A pale, unsettled-looking man insisted he had nothing to do with any of it either. Kale figured this whole case wasn't worth the hassle, but my eyes lit up regardless, convinced the culprit was standing right in front of us. I turned to the victim and asked exactly when the theft had occurred. She looked a little thrown by how eager I seemed, explaining it had happened at home, sometime around dinner last night, since the silverware had still been there then, but gone by breakfast this morning. She was certain one of these three was responsible, given how close they all lived to her. I asked each of them to walk me through where they'd been and what they were doing between last night and this morning. The first suspect, the goblin, said he'd finished organizing hay by nightfall, then went straight home and fell asleep, skipping dinner entirely. That struck me as odd, considering how sacred those 3 daily meals were to people in this era. The woman with crooked teeth refused to elaborate, calling it a personal matter that was none of my business, repeating that she already had a silver mirror at home. I pointed out that a silver mirror wasn't exactly common in an average household either, which only deepened my suspicion. The third suspect, pale as ever, insisted he hadn't left his house at all, that the only reason he was even standing outside now was because the woman herself had dragged him out. She quickly added that this man was clearly the most suspicious of the three, since this was the first time she'd ever laid eyes on his face. I found myself agreeing that detail alone raised plenty of red flags. I hadn't wanted to escalate things this far, but with no other option left, I figured we'd have to resort to the last measure available. Whatever the truth was, digging around their homes would eventually bring it to light. At the time, I had no idea that this little case, one I'd only picked up out of pure boredom, was about to spiral into something far bigger than I expected. Kai lost his patience the second he sensed the three of them dragging their feet, snapping that just because we'd been polite so far didn't mean they got to walk all over the guard. That left them with no real choice but to fall in line. Watching how all three of them had reacted, I got the sense each of them was hiding something they'd rather keep buried, which suited me fine, since I was bored out of my mind and this little mystery gave me something to chew on. First stop was the woman's place, where that silver mirror sat in plain view. She repeated her earlier point, that owning a mirror like that meant a missing silver spoon hardly registered as a concern for her. The room itself was sparse, almost bare, aside from that one mirror, which only deepened my suspicion. Something else caught my eye though, a pair of men's trousers tucked away, along with a faint, unmistakable smell lingering in the air. Looked like this woman had a lover on the side, which, in this era, counted as a serious offense. She hurried off and returned with food, insisting we must be exhausted and should eat something before continuing the investigation. Once I'd eaten her cooking, I found myself unable to push the matter any further. None of this was really my business anyway, so we moved on to the next house. The second man's home was stacked wall to wall with books, all of them, once we flipped through, turning out to be romance novels. That's when something caught my attention. A silver bracelet tucked neatly between the pages of one book. Genuinely nice piece, actually, one that would have paired well with what I was wearing. I figured if it quietly disappeared, the man probably wouldn't even notice. Right at that moment, a burp rumbled up from somewhere inside me, loud enough for Kai to catch. I quickly covered, claiming my shoulder felt a little stiff, that he must have misheard. Silently, I cursed the demon riding around inside me, wondering why it had chosen that exact second to make noise. Of course, Kai picked that precise moment to ask when exactly I'd started wearing a bracelet. I shot the pale man an awkward glance, but he just shrugged, telling me if I liked it, I was welcome to keep it. Turned out this guy was actually decent underneath it all, so I cleared him on the spot, declaring him innocent. Last stop was the goblin's house, and given the first two hadn't panned out, I figured this had to be where the real culprit was hiding, especially considering how suspicious he'd already been acting from the start. As far as anyone could tell, this whole process looked haphazard, but underneath it, I was actually running a genuine investigation. We stepped inside, planning to search the place thoroughly, only for both of us to freeze on the spot. Sitting right there in his house was an actual horse, fully done up in makeup. The goblin clearly adored the thing. I had absolutely nothing to say to that, and Kai, standing behind me, was equally speechless. I gave the guy a swift kick for good measure, since loving a horse this much bordered on excessive. Kai mentioned he'd heard this man was actually Cassidy City's most celebrated horse trainer. That left us in an awkward spot, since none of the three suspects looked guilty anymore. Right on cue though, the woman came rushing back, apologizing, explaining she'd found the spoon after all, tangled up somewhere in the hay. So, in the end, this whole excursion had been a waste of time. Not a total loss though. That night, I headed to the inn, grumbling about how the woman had wasted our entire afternoon chasing a spoon. Mini Fridge came over with a mug of beer, though something about her expression told me she was waiting on some kind of reaction from me. Before I could figure out what she was up to, My eyes widened, since floating inside that beer were 2 ice cubes carved delicately into the shape of roses. She looked genuinely proud of herself, insisting she'd worked really hard on them. Watching her light up like that, I couldn't help feeling a little warmth toward her too, though I pointed out that all that effort had gone into decorating ice cubes that were just gonna melt into beer anyway. Still, seeing how pleased she looked, I couldn't bring myself to burst that bubble. She was, after all, only 12. I figured it was probably time I tracked down an actual magic book for her. Right then, Kana spotted the bracelet on my wrist and leaned in, clearly curious. I raised my arm so she could get a better look, and it was obvious she genuinely liked it. So I handed the stolen bracelet straight over to her, which made her absolutely thrilled. A little worn, sure, but the qualities still held up nicely. It occurred to me that Skinny Fellow might actually be a decent guy after all, and someday I ought to buy him a loaf of fish head bread as a thank you. For reasons unknown to him, the pale man from earlier suddenly shivered where he stood, wondering if he was coming down with something. He silently cursed the whole assignment, wishing he'd never been sent to some backwater place like this in the first place. As far as he was concerned, a border city like Cassidy represented nothing but ignorance and barbarism, and worse still, ordinary commoners had actually dared to inconvenience a mage of the White Magic Tower. Something like this simply never happened back in the capital. The nerve to just barge straight into his home like that. He'd worried something exactly like this might happen, which was precisely why he'd cast identification magic on his books that morning, disguising them as harmless, ordinary novels to avoid exposing himself. But then he saw it. I'd found the bracelet. That thought alone sent a fresh wave of fear through him. Furious that I'd dared to lay a hand on something that wasn't mine to touch, something someone in my position had no business even noticing. Around that same moment, a faint red light had actually swept across my body, though I hadn't caught it at all. All he registered was pure shock that his magic had utterly failed to affect me. I wasn't a knight wielding holy power, just an ordinary guard by every appearance, and yet I'd walked off with that bracelet like it was nothing. Still, after mulling it over, he decided to let the matter drop. I wasn't worth the risk of revealing his true identity for. His mission, from the very start, had only ever been to investigate the one favored by Mana. The following day, as we kept up our watch at the gates, Brigg mentioned it seemed odd how much distance the Fenner family soldiers were keeping from us, Yaleheim especially. I just smiled, guessing they'd probably gotten thoroughly worked over by one of our guards after picking a fight in some tavern. Right then, a genuinely striking carriage rolled up, the kind the Fenner nobles usually rode in, the very same one Philip, their eldest son, had apparently been talking about earlier. I told Brigg to lower his head quickly, given a noble was passing through. We all bowed as the eldest Fenner's son moved past, the carriage never once slowing down. Typical, really. Nobles never bothering with basic manners. Right behind it came another carriage, and I flagged it down, since it struck me as suspicious. I asked the rider where they'd come from, and he identified himself as Sean, third-level administrator out of Karzan, here to collect the bounty rewards. I'd expected as much given the carriage. Sean thanked us for our courtesy and continued on inside. Brigg remarked how many carriages had rolled through that day, admitting he still fell out of his depth around high-ranking types. I told him to watch what he said from here on, since talk like that had a way of jinxing itself. Sure enough, another carriage arrived shortly after, this one bearing the church crest, and someone stepped out immediately, looking me over and guessing correctly that I was the honorary monk, offering the standard blessing of sunlight upon me. I figured this had to be the abbot and gave him the customary church greeting in return, though he corrected my form, pointing out my right elbow needed to sit higher. Based on that alone, he remarked, my devotion clearly matched what he'd heard in the reports, and suggested we speak properly sometime. With that, he rode off. Braid noted the fortress was getting noticeably busier these days, and I agreed without much argument. A while later, Nova came looking for me, and I asked what she was doing outside her office for once. She shot back, insisting she'd come specifically for the thing I was supposedly holding on to, telling me to hand it over. I retrieved what she'd asked for, a bloodied sack containing the fixer's head, along with the 2 others from that same fight, confirming this was exactly what she'd wanted. Sean confirmed it too, between bouts of gagging, which I couldn't help pointing out was a real talent. Managing to speak while dry heaving like that. As they prepared to head off, Sean mentioned he could stash the bag in the chest mounted behind the carriage. He seemed genuinely relieved the man had finally been caught, explaining he'd built a fearsome reputation under the name Wolf Ghost and that the organization tied to him had been causing serious trouble back in Karzan. That got me thinking, given the same man had been hunting for Canna specifically, would another fixer eventually come looking for her too? Possibly. Sean, glad the job was finally wrapped up, asked where he might find the best food in Kassertic Fortress, mentioning that exploring local restaurants happened to be his personal hobby. For a second, I considered pointing him toward Brigg's mother's cooking purely as a prank, but thought better of it. steering him instead toward Hassan's bakery over in District 3, suggesting we walk over together since it was close by. He agreed eagerly, thanking me, though he did pause to ask if I wasn't technically on duty right now. Truthfully, this was mostly a chance for me to dig up more about this organization of his. Once we arrived, the shop owner brought out a slice of cheesecake for each of us, calling it the shop's signature dish, mentioning that even his wife, once considered the most beautiful woman in Kasserdik Fortress, had adored it. Before he could finish that thought, I told Sean to ignore the rest and just enjoy the cake. He took a bite, relieved that the atmosphere around the fortress felt far calmer than he'd expected, having heard all sorts of unsettling rumors that had genuinely worried him given how the Lone Wolf Group operated. He explained the Lone Wolf was one of 3 major organizations running out of Karzan City, alongside the Frosty Dagger, an outfit with a long-standing history, and the Cute Rabbit, which functioned more like a citizens guild than a criminal group. On top of that, Wolf Ghost turned out to be a fixer working directly under Lone Wolf's banner. That surprised me, that even lowlifes like this had their own tangled hierarchy to navigate. I asked who led Lone Wolf. Sean looked a little thrown by how directly I'd asked, but explained it was someone named Philip, rumored to be the illegitimate son of a noble house, likely cast out after a failed attempt to poison the family's heir. The truly frightening thing about this man, apparently, was his possessiveness. There was a story going around how members of the Frosty Dagger had once walked into a tavern Philip owned and, half as a joke, walked off with a cheap decorative sword hanging on display. A minor thing, easy enough for most people to laugh off, but Philip took it as a personal violation and had every one of them dragged out just to retrieve that sword. That told me exactly what kind of animal I was dealing with. A real wolf through and through, the type that never let go once it had sunk its teeth into something. I couldn't help wondering if he considered Mini Fridge his property too, in that same way. Clearly, he hadn't figured out yet that biting down on the wrong thing could cost him his teeth entirely. Mulling it over, I decided a visit out that way was probably in order eventually, maybe framed as a quick 3-day business trip to the city. Just before Sean and, apparently, Nova headed out of the fortress, I mentioned I'd be tagging along, pointing out she'd already said she was heading out to handle some orange exports anyway. She asked what my actual reason was, and I told her I had some business waiting for me in Tarzan. She studied me for a beat before telling me to go ahead and handle it, trusting that I'd at least secured clearance from the outer fortress guard commander first, which I confirmed I had. Another guard approached Nova, questioning whether it was really wise to let me tag along, mentioning the inner fortress guards had already arranged their own escort for this trip. Nova pointed out that if our own guards left their posts, coverage would fall to the Fenner family soldiers by default, which meant prioritizing the outer fortress made more practical sense. The other guard muttered that this all felt a little too arbitrary, showing up right before departure and casually announcing plans to just drop by unannounced. Nova just shrugged it off, remarking that this was exactly why people called me a scoundrel, privately grateful that, once again, my presence had a way of untangling problems. At one point, she'd once told me that stepping into the guard leader role was simply a matter of time. Maybe even something higher still, but I'd turned down any talk of promotion, insisting my current position suited a scoundrel like me just fine. It occurred to her back then that trying to pin me down too tightly would only send me drifting off elsewhere entirely, that there was no real point digging too deep into my reasons, so long as I kept choosing to stick around Kasserdik Fortress for the long haul. With that settled, we set off for Karzan. Inside the carriage, I found myself asking Nova why she dressed up the way she had, wondering if she was putting in extra effort for the city trip. She didn't deny it, which meant I'd guessed right, but she just told me to be quiet about it. Still inside the carriage, Sean pulled out another cheesecake, offering it to Nova, calling her Miss Orange. She turned him down flat, claiming she had things to handle, telling him if he needed company, the guy sitting next to her was fair game instead. Sean looked genuinely puzzled by how quickly she'd shut him down, especially after using the same nickname I'd been calling her by. Wanting to see him get a little closer to her, I leaned in and murmured that he'd gotten the pronunciation slightly off, that it wasn't orange, it was orange. He took that completely at face value and tried the name out on her exactly as I'd coached him. After a long stretch of travel, we finally rolled into Mount Kaler City. Nopo informed everyone we needed to regroup at this inn before noon the next day, and warned me specifically not to cause any trouble, insisting that any time I entered or left a building, it had to be through the front door like a normal person. I just smiled, grabbed the blonde kid beside me, and walked off saying I'd see her tomorrow. That set Nopo off immediately, wondering if I just left without actually agreeing to anything. Still, she figured, I probably wouldn't do anything too catastrophic. I asked Shunai to show me around Mount Kaler. He was happy to oblige, offering to take me to a well-regarded restaurant called Choke to Death Pig. I told him the restaurant could wait until next time, since tonight I planned on killing the leader of Lone Wolf. That froze him solid on the spot, insisting I had to be joking. Being the sharp one he was, he decided not to take that seriously at all, waving it off casually, telling me to do whatever I wanted, kill the guy if that was really the plan, since he'd never liked him anyway. That answer suited me perfectly. Clearly we were on the same page here, which meant this would probably go smoothly. So I suggested we start by scoping out Cute Rabbit first. Privately, Shunai figured that if I enjoyed joking this much, he'd humor me all the way through to the punchline. We reached the place shortly after, though the members inside looked nothing like their name suggested. Shunai had already braced himself to watch me humiliate myself, fully prepared to jump in the second I opened my mouth and said something stupid. But barely 3 seconds in, he froze completely, overwhelmed by just how potent the smell hanging in that tavern actually was. That drew immediate hostility from the members inside, who demanded to know if we found their smell that disgusting. This particular tavern operated under Cold Dagger's careful management, one of those places in Mount Kaler best left unvisited. Watching Shunai's reaction left me at a loss for words, though I'd come with a clear purpose in mind regardless. Time slipped by quickly, and night settled in. I felt satisfied enough with the groundwork we'd laid. Time to track down that wolf. I told Shunai to lead me to a casino called Lucky Gambler. He still assumed I was joking, warning me that place belonged to Lone Wolf directly and looked even more dangerous than the tavern we just left, which was exactly the point as far as I was concerned. If I wanted to smoke out that hidden leader, I first needed to tear apart his den. That's when it finally clicked for Shunai that I genuinely wasn't kidding around. My earlier line about killing the Lone Wolf leader echoed back in his mind, and matching those words against the look on my face, his thoughts jumped straight to Nova, suspecting sticking close to me might come with its own risks entirely. By then, though, there was no backing out, since I already had him by the collar, dragging him forward and telling him to lead the way. An hour later, another massive blaze tore through the district. Someone bellowed furiously about how that big bastard responsible would pay with his life for having the nerve to cheat right there in their own territory. Though for the moment, putting the fire out took priority. The chestnut-haired man standing guard there went by Chiron, Lone Wolf's gatekeeper. Mount Kaler typically buzzed with nightlife, but that evening's chaos clearly exceeded the usual noise level. Even so, Chiron figured that even if a full-blown war erupted, his job was simply to hold the entrance. Right then, I materialized beside him, greeting him with a smile and asking how his night had been going, guessing it must be rough. He assumed I was just drunk, telling me to clear off if I had no business there, since he had a gate to guard. I mentioned that none of the other organizations bothered posting anyone at their doors tonight, remarking that Lone Wolf's leader must be a fairly cowardly sort. Even Chiron wasn't foolish enough to miss the hostile intent behind that comment, warning me to watch my mouth, insisting his boss wasn't the type to die easily, that he'd never encountered anyone as ruthless in his entire life. The man carried a magic weapon capable of burning any opponent to ash instantly, and scarier still was the knight standing guard over him. The mention of a knight genuinely caught my attention. Chiron kept going, describing a knight with a ruined right hand, someone who drank like it was the only thing keeping him alive, yet still lived up to a reputation earned as the sword of humanity. On top of that, 40 loyal members served as his personal enforcers, untouchable as a result. I gave Chiron a light pat on the shoulder, thanking him sincerely, admitting I could have just ignored him entirely and walked straight past, but something about him reminded me of my younger self, and I was glad I'd stopped to talk. I promised to make sure whoever took over next would remember his contribution here tonight. Chiron, still convinced I was simply drunk, listened as I told him plainly that nobody in this world was truly beyond dying. Knights, nobles, emperors, it made no difference. Cut open the right throat and every one of them went down the same way. A fairly fair rule when you thought about it. I suggested that once Philip actually died, he should walk away from this line of work entirely, go back to the start and really think about what he was good at instead. Kieran just stood there, completely baffled, clearly too far gone to register that I'd already slipped past him and inside. Elsewhere, I made my way to the tavern's entrance itself. Inside, singing and dancing filled the air, everyone lost in a haze of indulgence, roughly 40 members scattered throughout, meaning my diversion plan was clearly working as intended. I had paid off a few contacts from Cute Rabbit and Cold Dagger to stir up small pockets of trouble around the district, and given how long they'd apparently resented Lone Wolf, they'd agreed to the job far more readily than I'd anticipated. With the outside chaos providing perfect cover, I'd already sent my walking map when I safely back to the inn. Only one task remained now. Before long, someone stepped into view ahead of me, eyeing me with obvious irritation, demanding to know who I was. If my guess was right, this had to be the knight Chiron had warned me about earlier. Bluffing my way past this one clearly wasn't an option. He rose slowly to his feet, and sizing him up, He really did look like the washed-up drunk Gurn had described. Compared to him, my body had been conditioned relentlessly. Still, victory wasn't a given, not with that particular knight's aura working against me. He set the bottle down and lunged at me, moving like an entirely different person the instant the fight began. Unlike an ordinary blade, clashing directly against a sword infused with that kind of aura would shatter mine outright, which was exactly why knights typically aim to break their opponent's weapon first, a tactic that also happened to be their biggest weakness. I used that against him, feinting a strike from the front before slipping around to the back, anticipating exactly where his full-strength swing would land. Pushing forward, I drove the hilt of my blade straight into his shoulder blade, breaking his focus for just a heartbeat. Our strength genuinely felt evenly matched, odds sitting somewhere around 50-50, with only the smallest margin deciding who walked away. And that margin, in the end, favored me. The fight cost me my own sword in the process, though. I picked up his blade instead, giving it a few practice swings, finding it surprisingly solid despite some wear. Since I'd be taking it with me, I figured the least I could do was wish him peace and death. That same night, Nova stirred awake to a wall of noise outside. Irritated at first, wondering if cities were simply always this loud, unable to get any real sleep because of it. She threw open her door, ready to shout at whoever was responsible, only to find half the city ablaze, buildings collapsing, people locked in chaotic brawls everywhere she looked. Startled, her mind jumped straight to me, which honestly confused even her. Surely I had nothing to do with this. Then again, maybe. No, surely not, she told herself. Continuing through the hideout, I eventually reached an elaborately decorated door. Thugs like this, I figured, never really changed their taste for gold, no matter the era. I kicked it open easily enough, and sure enough, the room beyond looked every bit as extravagant as some noble's private quarters. Clearly a man obsessed with the trappings of status. A group approached almost immediately, one of them demanding to know where exactly I thought I had the nerve to set foot, warning that catching the attention of the 4 heavenly knights meant I shouldn't expect to walk out of here with all my limbs intact. I couldn't help laughing at that. These weren't any 4 heavenly knights. What stood in front of me were closer to 3 little piglets, one of them so visibly rattled he'd retreated all the way to the back of the room. Before any of them could act, though, the man I assumed was Lone Wolf himself cut in, asking how exactly I'd managed to get this far, pointing out he'd personally stationed his guard knight Behan along the corridors. I told him plainly that I hadn't run into anyone resembling a knight. One of the so-called heavenly knights recognized the sword in my hand as Behan's own, prompting Lone Wolf to burst out laughing, remarking he'd paid a small fortune for that night. Quite the unfortunate turn of events. What exactly did I want with him? I told him it was pretty obvious I'd come here to kill him. That set him off laughing, even harder, calling it hilarious. Genuinely so, though he suggested that if I truly believed I had the confidence to pull that off, I ought to know something first, that behind him stood connections reaching Count Bahart, first-level administrator of Nuili, and even Mayor Gurum beyond that, tied all the way up into the imperial family itself. Could I really handle backlash on that scale? He offered me an easy out, telling me not to be afraid, that he'd generously overlook this whole stunt if I simply pressed my forehead to the ground. I answered by taking his head clean off, leaving the entire room stunned into silence. I remarked, almost amused, that I hadn't expected him to walk directly into my range on his own 2 feet, wondering aloud if he'd genuinely believed those threats would carry any weight with me. Unfortunately for him, plenty of people far more dangerous than mayors and nobles were already looking for me. Right then, his corpse erupted into flame, confirming exactly what Gurn had described earlier. That magic weapon of his. I called the remaining 4 heavenly knights forward and settled into the throne, announcing that effective immediately, I'd be holding interviews for the newly vacant position of Lone Wolf's leader. The 4th knight, lingering in the back, looked visibly shaken, watching how I hadn't so much as flinched at Philip's threats before ending him outright, clearly wondering what exactly I wanted from any of them. I sweetened the incentive a little, mentioning that failing this particular interview came with a punishment of being burned at the stake. That got everyone talking fast, each one rushing to sell themselves, calling their crew the human grinders, boasting about 100 heads claimed and flawless kidnappings that left no trace behind. But the leaner of the remaining knights simply stepped forward and smacked one of the 3 piglets clean off his feet with a single blow, introducing himself as Dante, explaining he'd been handling the actual operational work of Lone Wolf for a long time now, and formally requesting the position once I'd finished handling Lone Wolf's former leader. The group settled in for a meeting to sort through the chaos from the previous night. Right in the middle of it, Sean came rushing in clutching a box, apologizing for showing up late. He was so forgettable looking that half the room didn't even register who he was until he introduced himself. 3rd-level administrator Sean. Everyone assumed the box held gifts meant for the group. He quickly corrected that assumption, explaining this wasn't for anyone else, that a friend had given it to him personally. That answer clearly irritated the man across from him, who snapped at Sean to hurry up and take his seat already so the meeting could continue. Sean found a spot and sat down without much fuss, though someone in the room clearly had it out for him, mocking the idea of a mere civilian showing up late with such nerve, guessing out loud that whatever gift his friend had given him was probably worthless too. Sean just sat there, stunned that Puli was pulling this stunt again. Ordinarily, he would have let it slide without a second thought, but something about spending the previous day alongside me seemed to have rubbed off on him, sharpening his own edge a little. So, this time, he told the man flatly to shut his mouth, grabbing him by the collar and warning him to keep that filthy tongue away from a gift given to him by a friend. The box slipped from his hands. Philip's head sat there, along with the head of the knight who'd guarded him. Sheer panic swept through the room instantly, nobody having imagined Philip could actually be killed. As it happened, I'd chatted with Sean a while back, and he'd mentioned that any real shot at promotion was practically hopeless unless he could somehow present Philip's head as proof. Just the night before, I'd told my men to wrap everything up neatly and pass it along as a gift. Dante turned to me afterward, asking what direction he should take Lone Wolf in going forward. I told him I didn't have any particular demands, that he was free to run things however he saw fit. All I'd really wanted out of this was to make sure nobody came around bothering Mini Fridge again. I added one more thing, telling him to look after third-level administrator Sean and also the gatekeeper Gurn. Beyond that, I told Dante to build the organization however he saw fit, to lead well, and to make sure I never had a reason to come back out here again. Dante promised that once I returned home, he'd send regular reports my way, along with a few gold coins tucked in for good measure. The instant I heard gold coins mentioned, my whole face lit up. Once that business was wrapped up, I made a stop at a purification shop. Studying the strange, mystical figure standing across from me, the demon lodged inside my chest grumbled its distaste, complaining about how much it hated the light. I told it to behave itself, since these purification sessions weren't cheap. Sure enough, once the man finished his chanting, a plume of black smoke rose off my body, and for a moment it felt like my soul itself had been yanked clean out of me. A heartbeat later, though, my entire body felt remarkably refreshed. The purification ran 20 silver coins, and I handed him a full gold piece instead, asking if he'd be willing to travel for work. I mentioned the mage back home I wanted trained properly, and told him if he came to Cassidy and taught her a few spells, there'd be even more coin waiting for him there. He said he might as well relocate to Cassidy City outright at that point. Just as I turned to leave, he stopped me and leaned down to blow gently over my shoes. By the time he finished, he looked completely drained, insisting this particular service was on the house. Clearly a man who understood how to run a business properly. I thanked him and told him my name was Aaron, and that whenever he was ready, he could find me in Cassidy City. Meanwhile, Nopo had been wandering the city, eventually arriving at our agreed meeting spot, only to freeze the moment she stepped inside. There I was, sitting in a chair, fast asleep. She found herself a little caught off guard by how peaceful I looked in that state, and looking closer, admitted the sight was actually fairly handsome. She settled in beside me and worked through some documents while I slept clean through half the day. Still, Nobo had her doubts, asking pointedly if I'd stayed out that late without causing any trouble. I told her plainly that I hadn't smashed any walls. She pressed further, asking if there was anything else worth confessing to. Then she caught herself, deciding she'd rather not know, that she had no interest in becoming an accomplice, insisting I keep whatever else happened to myself. Something still felt off to her, a nagging suspicion that I'd pulled off something significant the night before. She eyed the armor piled beside me and asked what exactly that was about. I told her this stuff was genuinely impressive, that in an era like this, iron counted as one of the most valuable, practical things a person could own. She clearly couldn't wrap her head around my taste in souvenirs, especially once I tossed an entire suit of it straight into her lap, telling her a little thing like this should fit her fine. She examined it skeptically, the size clearly nowhere near right for her frame. Just as our carriage rounded a bend in the road, a horse's neigh rang out, followed almost immediately by a volley of arrows striking the carriage. Looking closer, I noticed these were crude stone-tipped arrows. Stone arrows, though, meant one thing specifically: goblins. Scanning the area, I counted somewhere north of 20 of them. That raised an obvious question. Why would goblins band together in a group that large and move in coordination like this? Was there a goblin settlement somewhere nearby? And told Little Orange to stay inside the carriage, figuring I'd handle this batch solo. One goblin charged in first, and a light swing of my blade cut him clean through at the waist. My body moved forward almost on instinct after that, snatching up another one, slamming it into the ground, and ending it with a simple squeeze. Still, something about this felt off. Ordinary goblins would usually break off the hunt and scatter once you'd taken down 5 or 6 of them, but these kept pushing forward, growing bolder rather than more cautious. Nopo stepped out of the carriage once things had quieted, asking if the fight was finally over. It was, technically, But nothing about this situation sat right with me. These goblins had clearly been under someone's control, and the black residue coating the ground was a telltale trace of black magic. That meant a black mage had passed through here at some point, though it was hard to imagine why one would bother. I couldn't shake the suspicion that whatever target they were after might connect back to the noble young lady herself, which meant heading straight back to Cassidy City was the smarter move. Honestly, it was getting exhausting. That same day, 2 guards stood watch at the fortress gates, one remarking how unusually quiet things had been lately. The other pointed out the obvious reason that I'd headed off to Karzan, so the calm made perfect sense, adding that carriage traffic had also thinned out considerably given how frequently the roads were getting hit with attacks. The younger one admitted he actually appreciated the peaceful pace to inspections for once, right up until he spotted someone approaching who looked remarkably like me. I stopped to greet them both, telling them they'd done good work holding down the fort. The older guard asked what had happened, wondering where the carriage had gone. I explained there'd been a fair number of monsters along the way, so I'd figured I might as well clean things up a bit while I was at it. Right then, something tumbled out of one of my bags, a goblin's severed member, and the older guard demanded to know what exactly that grotesque thing was. I filled him in that these were supposedly great for stamina, notoriously hard to come by in the open market. The younger guard couldn't quite believe it, leaning in to ask if I'd cut him a deal if he bought a few on the spot, admitting he was curious about the effects. I told him they usually ran 70 copper apiece, but since these were fresh, I'd let him have them for 60. Right on cue, Nova screamed at me from behind, telling me to quit peddling goblin parts and get her home already since she desperately wanted a shower. I tossed the goods over to the younger guard, telling him he could settle up later since I really needed to get moving, though my throw came out a little crooked and ended up smacking the older guard square in the face instead. Just like that, I was back at Casterdick Fortress. I headed to my unit and handed out the pauldrons I picked up along the way, with Dylan absolutely beside himself with excitement, insisting he'd never received a gift this good. I'd figured armor would land well with his crew, and Dylan mentioned he'd heard something big had gone down in Karzan, marveling at the timing given I'd apparently just been passing through Tarzan when it happened. I shrugged it off as pure coincidence. Kale and Poole clearly weren't buying the innocent act either. Hannah wandered over, telling everyone to make some room, and I asked how business had been holding up. That only irritated her further, explaining they'd been completely unable to sell anything lately. On top of that, the Lord had started seizing rations, citing cleanup preparations as the excuse, taking even the pickled meats, leaving them scraping together just enough food to feed themselves. She cursed the Lord thoroughly for it. Dylan figured it was smarter to keep his distance from her mood at that point, though Kale pointed out the headband she had on, something he hadn't seen before, remarking how well it suited her. She admitted it was a gift I'd brought back for her, asking if it looked good, and that seemed to melt her irritation away almost entirely. I asked if anything else had happened while I'd been away. Vermin said things had mostly stayed routine, though the church had come looking for me at some point, specifically the new abbot arriving from the capital, someone who apparently proved difficult to satisfy. There was also chatter about some new group assembling in District 6, all unfamiliar faces. That struck me as odd, since District 6 belongs squarely to the father-son duo, Jackson and Scar, who exactly had the nerve to set up shop in their territory. Heading over to check it out, the smell hit me almost immediately. Were people still relieving themselves in the streets over there? Vermin mentioned that, thanks to my efforts, that particular habit had dropped off considerably. We eventually located the group Vermin had mentioned, and I called one of them over. He approached looking every bit as slippery as a snake, thanking me for my hard work patrolling and asking if something was wrong. I looked him over, admitting this was the first time I'd laid eyes on him, and asked his name. He introduced himself as George. I asked what business he and his rough-looking companions had setting up in Casterdick Fortress. George explained this had been his late mother's hometown, that he'd come here alongside friends who'd been working elsewhere, having heard good things about settling down in a quieter spot like this to start something new. I told him plainly I had little to say to someone carrying that kind of attitude, that if he'd been outright rude about it, at least an honest conversation would have been easier to come by. Still, I told the group to strip down right there on the spot, since there was no more reliable method for confirming whether anyone had ties to demons. They complied, and sure enough, plenty of tattoos turned up across the group, no demonic markings. George handed over a silver coin, remarking that this was simply how life worked out sometimes. With that, I let them go. Scar, I figured, was about to have his hands full dealing with this new arrangement. I mentioned we should head over to the synagogue, since I'd been summoned there. Once we arrived, Bion practically shouted the moment he saw me, insisting he needed a favor from me as an honorary monk, demanding I kill that wretched Brighton. That caught me off guard, thinking this man was clearly the real troublemaker here, and asked who exactly Brighton was. Bion looked genuinely stunned. I didn't know, explaining this was the new abbot, describing him as a vicious demon and a thoroughly cursed man. I wondered if Bion had genuinely lost his mind, But he barreled ahead regardless, ranting about how sick he'd grown of prayer recitals, holy scripture readings, and morning prayers. I pointed out that those things seemed like exactly what a priest should be doing in the first place. But Beyond waved that off, sliding over a retainer fee and promising more once the job was done. I couldn't help thinking a priest openly requesting the murder of his own abbot. Once I actually met Brighton myself, though, I understood exactly what Bion had been complaining about. He immediately questioned how an honorary monk could possibly not know the prayer recital, insisting I follow along, and pointing out that even a busy life left no excuse to skip memorizing holy scripture, recalling how he himself had once stayed up entire nights, eyes wide open, working through it as a young monk. He handed me a copy of the scripture since I apparently didn't own one, and told me firmly to show up at the synagogue right as the sun started rising each morning, since that was when everyone gathered to pray these days, insisting it would strengthen my faith. 3 hours into his lecture, I found myself wondering if I was genuinely expected to sit through this every single day going forward, seriously reconsidering whether taking Bion's offer might actually be worth it. The man clearly relished calling others out, and I told myself that the moment he showed even a hint of hypocrisy, I'd put a fist straight through his face without hesitation. But following him around for the rest of the day, I couldn't find a single crack in his conduct. He personally went around blessing children along the way, genuinely the first time I'd encountered someone this earnest among the medieval crowd I'd grown used to. Once the day wrapped up, Brighton told me I'd done well, admitting he hadn't initially thought I fit the role of honorary monk, but having watched me stick with him clear through to the end of the day, he could tell my faith carried real weight after all. He added that while true devotion wasn't measured purely by scriptural knowledge, the text still held plenty of worthwhile lessons, and recommended I keep reading it. I genuinely couldn't find any justification left for hitting the guy. We kept up the patrol together until the day finally closed out. The next morning, right as the sun crested the mountain, Brighton woke me up personally, asking how I'd slept and remarking what a perfect morning it was for prayer. I slammed the door shut in his face and sat back down, having never expected this man to track me down all the way to my own room. Brighton, apparently, had also heard I trained religiously every morning without fail, and declared that sincere effort counted as its own form of devotion, so he'd be joining me for training too, ensuring I never skipped my prayers along the way. That day, I headed out hunting with my squad. The monsters waiting for us turned out to be goblins, small fry that stood no real chance against me, and even a light punch from me proved fatal. The killing intent rowing off me during that fight was practically tangible, and by the end, I'd handled every last one of them myself. What I hadn't expected, though, was how easily Pula ended up dying in the middle of it. Kai sighed beside me, remarking what a hard-working, decent guy Pula had been, calling it a genuine shame. Dylan suggested we ramp up patrols outside the city walls, pointing out how strange it was for trolls to be showing up this close to the edge of town in the first place. That set Kai off, kicking one of the goblin corpses in frustration, cursing the nobles under his breath. Before long, word came through that all the bodies had been cleared and asking if we should head back. Something about the sledge sitting in front of me, though, didn't sit right, so I made my way back into town. On the way, I spotted the heresy inquisitor perched up in a tree, eating something. I glanced up out of pure instinct, then quickly looked away. As expected, not a single normal person seemed to exist around here. This time, though, traces of black magic had turned up on the troll corpses too. Troublesome, certainly, but not something I could just brush aside. The only person I could reasonably discuss this with was Brighton. Trouble was, the priest currently looked both furious and swamped. I immediately recognized the poor soul on the receiving end of his scolding. The same man who'd sold me potions before. Someone I'd honestly considered teaching a lesson myself at one point. Turned out Brighton had beaten me to it, stripping him of his potion inventory duties entirely and reassigning him to scrub the courtyard instead. The moment he spotted me approaching, though, his expression shifted instantly into a warm smile, greeting me like nothing had happened. I filled him in on what I'd found earlier, that clearing out monsters that day had turned up clear traces of a black mage's involvement. He connected the dots immediately, realizing this explained the sudden uptick in monster activity around Cassie City lately. In the end, 4 people had lost their lives to the trolls during that fight, and his expression darkened the moment he registered that. 4 actual human lives lost. His gaze turned genuinely frightening after that. He told me to stay put and not wander off while he attended to something urgent. Before heading off, he turned back to ask if I'd seen the Heresy Inquisitor anywhere. That's when it dawned on me that even she'd apparently been avoiding him. The monastery director, it seemed, had gone directly to the Lord. The Lord himself, indecisive up until that point, had suddenly issued an order forbidding any of the bodies from being moved until the cleanup was properly finished, a clear sign of just how much sway the monastery director actually held. He was even planning to personally oversee the funeral. Genuinely an unusual man. So, when exactly was the major cleanup operation supposed to start? Word from the noble and his less than sharp aide indicated it had originally been scheduled 3 days out, but the timeline had gotten pushed up to the very next day. The young lady, thankfully, wouldn't be joining this particular outing, staying safely within the city instead, which honestly made perfect sense. There wasn't much reason to drag her along on a monster clearing operation. The real concern was that if a black mage really was orchestrating these attacks, the whole thing could just be bait designed to fracture the city's defenses. Turning that thought over, I couldn't help but laugh a little. Whatever came of it, that particular headache belonged to Nopo and the monastery director to untangle. Black mage involvement or not, Cassie City's forces were bound to end up split regardless, sent out to deal with the surrounding monster threat while still needing enough coverage left behind to keep the young lady safe inside the walls. Eventually, the final arrangement got settled. Forces would split into 3 groups. The first would head out to handle the monster threat directly. I'd be placed in the second group holding the city gate. The third, under Ben's command, would focus on protecting the young lady. Beyond those 3, a separate unit would operate independently, with the Heresy Inquisitor free to reinforce whichever side needed her most. Then the priest launched right back into prayer, giving both me and the Inquisitor a genuine headache over it. And apparently the demon riding along inside me wasn't spared either. Night fell soon after. Somewhere in the dark, a mysterious figure asked how preparations were coming along. Another voice answered that they'd successfully used monster attacks to lure as much of the city's deployed force away as possible. Satisfied, the woman remarked that all that effort releasing goblins and trolls on a steady schedule hadn't gone to waste after all. One of her subordinates sounded uneasy though, questioning whether stirring up this much chaos was wise, pointing out that even a remote outpost like this still technically fell under the Empire's protection. She dismissed that concern outright, declaring that once their master consumed the heart of the one beloved by Mana, they'd never have to hide from hypocrites like these again, insisting she wasn't some incompetent fool, that every piece of this plan would unfold precisely the way she intended. Her subordinate mentioned there still appeared to be guards holding the city, meaning all that remained was actually forcing the gate open. She snapped her fingers dismissively, questioning why he made it sound so simple, since breaching a city gate was no small feat. At the snap of her fingers, a horde of monsters materialized behind her, entirely under her control. Even a remote border town still counted as a proper city, and mediocre forces alone wouldn't be enough to crack it open. The infiltrators already planted inside were presumably occupied handling the resident knights as it stood. Given that, she decided it was time to bring in the Night Hunter, planning to force the gate with sheer overwhelming strength. Her subordinate replied that the Night Hunter would likely be running late, having apparently gotten lost again. That answer infuriated her, since without him, breaking through the gate looked next to impossible. Patience running thin, she opted to strike first regardless, ordering everyone to prepare to bring out every corpse they'd carried along, and began directing her monsters straight toward the city gate. Right then, a figure dropped from the sky, landing with a single stomp directly on top of one of the creatures below, obliterating the clinging thing on impact. The sight left both of them visibly shaken, wondering what exactly this terrifying figure was, his entire body glowing red. As for me, standing right there in the middle of it, I was thrilled. I'd genuinely been wondering what I'd do if nobody showed up tonight. Right before the attack hit, Brighton had us sitting through another Holy Scripture session, me and the Inquisitor both trapped there with him. Around that point, I found myself genuinely wishing a demon would just show up already, anything at all to yank us out of this particular hell. As if summoned by that thought, the clinging, entangled thing appeared and started slamming itself against the fortress gates. Brighton looked over, remarking, with an oddly bright smile, that this was rather bad. I tore into the creature over and over, hacking away without pause. Somewhere in the chaos, a cloaked figure watching from a distance wondered aloud what exactly this monster tearing through the fight actually was. Afflet noted how precisely I was cutting along the creature's joints, landing every strike dead center despite the surrounding chaos. Then the entangled thing caught my blade in one hand, attempting to crush my shoulder in response, so I sank my teeth straight into its flesh instead, forcing it to release its grip. Whatever dark mage had cobbled this thing together had been unusually generous, practically drawing dotted lines for me to slice along. At the same time, the Inquisitor carved into the creature from another angle, and I found myself pleased watching how effortlessly she cut through it, holy power really being the gold standard against demons. Still, the thing refused to go down entirely, rising one final time under Afflet's continued influence. She made it clear she didn't care whether we were knights, inquisitors, or anything else, insisting she'd kill every one of us regardless. With one massive sweeping strike, the Inquisitor finally put the creature down for good, and in that same redirected motion, cut straight through Afflet too, catching even me off guard with how casually brutal that finishing blow had been. The cloaked man tried bolting the second Afflet dropped, and the Inquisitor moved to cut him down as well, but I told her to hold off. These types were skilled at brainwashing demonic beasts, sure, but their actual combat ability against a trained knight was practically non-existent. We needed to hear him out first, figure out exactly what they'd been planning by attacking us like this. She argued that conversing with a demon counted as one of the gravest sins imaginable, but I pointed out this was a necessary step to prevent further casualties, and besides, the men looked human enough to me. The cloaked figure agreed quickly, insisting he was just a dark mage. Before he could ramble further, I planted a kick square into his head, telling him to cut the excess talk and just answer the questions, starting with his name. He gave it as Perrin. Crouching down beside him, I asked why exactly demons kept ambushing us out of nowhere, telling him to lay it out plainly enough for everyone to follow. He explained there was a rumor circulating among a gathering of dark mages known as the Assembly, that consuming the heart of the one beloved by mana would grant a mage the very peak of magical power. This particular plan, he said, had been in motion for days already, meaning the inner fortress was likely deep in chaos of its own by now. He begged, having told us everything, for us to spare him. Before I could even respond, the Inquisitor drove her fist straight into his skull, then finished him off entirely. Earlier, Ben had made a point of insisting he wouldn't let his guard down the way he had before, worried about a possible attack somewhere within the fortress. He might not have looked it, but he genuinely carried real strength for a knight, worth trusting on that front. Honestly, that reassurance did nothing for me, considering how useless he'd proven himself last time around. Still, knight or not, surely he wouldn't get wiped out the same way twice. Nova, presumably, had made her own preparations too, ensuring the inner fortress wouldn't collapse the instant trouble hit. Brighton called down from above, asking if we could hear him, telling us to give him just a moment while he finished a round of prayers on our behalf before joining us. The Inquisitor and I exchanged a look and took off running toward the inner fortress, certain by then that it had to be in genuine danger. Meanwhile, back at Kasserdic Fortress's rear gate, where Poole and Dylan were stationed, an enormous man appeared, asking if this was indeed Kasserdic Fortress. Poole immediately reached for his sword, demanding the man identify himself, but Dylan, picking up on something in the air, smacked Poole across the head instead, launching into a friendly explanation that this was indeed Kasserdic Fortress, tucked into the eastern edge of the Empire, well known for its clean water and fresh air, welcoming him warmly through the gate. He'd done it purely on instinct, having caught the unmistakable scent of death rolling off this man. Had they tried standing their ground here, they'd have died on the spot. The giant looked Dylan over and asked if he was a knight. Dylan told him honestly he wasn't. Satisfied with that, the man walked on past, wishing them a good night. Inside the fortress itself, black flames erupted without warning. Dylan figured this had to be dark mage handiwork, while Ben rushed to check on the young lady, asking if she was safe. She threw herself into his arms immediately, admitting how frightened she'd been. He reassured her she was safe now that he'd arrived, urging her to move quickly with him to safety. Right then, though, sharp pain tore through his armor, and he staggered back away from her. The damage was already done, and it became clear she wasn't entirely herself, or rather, wasn't herself at all. Ben insisted his lady would never do something like this. The demon slowly shed its disguise, remarking that men really were all the same, losing their heads the instant beauty came near. Ben admitted he knew nothing about that, only that he preferred her current appearance regardless, wondering bitterly if that made him just another fool falling for the same trick. After all his talk about staying alert, he imagined what I would say if I saw this unfold. He resolved not to let that happen. Not again. He charged straight at Crimson Darkness, who dodged, visibly surprised he could still move that fast despite his injuries. Ben, watching her dodge, realized she wasn't nearly as formidable as he'd assumed. Figuring that without his wounds slowing him down, he'd have cut her apart in a single stroke. He surged forward again with enough speed that she had no room left to react, swinging his blade upward, convinced this was the finishing blow. But before the strike landed, something took Ben down first, leaving him crumpled on the ground, completely defeated. Another member of the society, Hearth, had intervened. Ben cursed under his breath, realizing there'd been a second demon lurking this entire time. Hearth told Crimson Darkness that it had been a close call, exactly what happens when she insisted on taking a knight on solo. He flung Ben clean out of the fortress, who, even as he flew, was convinced he'd actually had the demon beaten this time. Crimson Darkness demanded to know why Hearth had interfered, insisting she'd wanted to tear that bastard apart limb from limb. Hearth calmly told her to knock it off, that they were burning time they didn't have, but she snapped back that she wasn't leaving until she'd finished scratching him apart entirely. Hearth reminded her, evenly, that continuing to act however she pleased would only draw their master's fury, clarifying he wasn't telling her to hold back completely, but pointing out that escaping the fortress, night or no night, was already going to be difficult enough. He'd slip out quietly while she kept everyone distracted, delivering the one favored by mana straight to their master. Meanwhile, I kept running alongside the Inquisitor, noting how unnervingly quiet the town felt despite everything unfolding. That's when we spotted the same giant man Dylan and Poole had waved through earlier, wandering around looking visibly lost. I wondered if he was another dark mage given the robe he wore. The man turned to me, asking if I happened to know the way to Casterdic Fortress, admitting he seemed to have lost his way. That threw me a little, considering the fortress was easily the largest structure in the entire area. A sly grin crept across my face, and I addressed him as Elder, telling him it was only natural to get lost around here, since Cassic's layout confused plenty of people. I explained the fortress itself sat apart from the main city entirely, a decision made by a former lord who'd considered it beneath him to share living quarters with commoners, prompting him to build a separate residence altogether. I told him to head out through the main gate, turn left, and keep walking straight until he spotted a large fortress ahead. Naturally, this was about as blatant a lie as anyone could tell, but he took it completely at face value, thanking me sincerely. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I happened to be a knight. I told him plainly that I wasn't, just a lowly guard captain. That seemed to relieve him further, remarking that a kind young man like me surely couldn't be a knight. I figured this was just modern wisdom at work, since I genuinely didn't have the time to fight every single one of these people tonight. Right then, Dylan came sprinting over, screaming that we had a serious problem. Some man just as massive, maybe even bigger, had gotten inside the fortress, insisting he was the only one capable of handling someone that size, telling him I'd already taken care of it. Dylan looked stunned, marveling that this was exactly what he'd expect from his big brother. I told him that was enough celebrating, that a dark mage had shown up, and he needed to drop patrol duty and follow me into the inner fortress instead. Dylan cursed himself for ever agreeing to come along in the first place, though he quickly confirmed he'd follow me to the ends of the earth regardless. Once we reached the fortress, I found Ben sprawled out in the bushes yet again. This guy really was inhuman, somehow managing to lose that many times in a row. Since I couldn't just leave him lying there, I told Dylan to stay behind and keep watch over him. He agreed instantly, swearing he'd see this particular mission through even if it cost him his life, clearly relieved he didn't have to tag along with me any further. Right around then, an explosion tore through the fortress, and I figured that pinpointed exactly where the real fight was happening. Stepping inside, I found bodies scattered everywhere, some already dead, others frozen in terror. A demon had clearly torn straight through here, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. At a fork in the corridor, I exchanged a glance with the Inquisitor before we split off in different directions. Making my way through the halls, I heard a woman scream, and it turned out to be Vivian, who rushed straight toward me, clutching at my chest, insisting demons were after her, that she'd barely managed to escape, that they were still chasing her down. On pure instinct, I cut straight into her chest. She demanded to know why. I told her simply that it was instinct, that no matter how urgent things seemed, someone getting this physically close to me felt off. Crimson Darkness dropped the disguise right then, furious that something this small had given her away, vowing to tear me apart limb from limb. At the same time, the demon riding inside my own chest urged me forward, telling me to eat it, pointing straight at the blackened patch spreading across her chest, the very mark known as the demon's handprint. The demon inside me pushed harder, explaining that restoring its full power would stretch out both the duration and the potency of what knights called aura. I told it plainly that meant I could finally stop being some kind of glorified quick draw, a nickname the demon absolutely despised. I swung my blade in a wild dash, severing Crimson Darkness's arm clean off, and pointed out that whatever transformation she was in the middle of was taking far too long. In response, she slammed her other arm into me, now grotesquely enlarged, opening some distance between us. Even she seemed to register, though, that this fight was tipping against her. I could see how tough that blackened skin of hers had become, but rather than back off, she pushed her demonic energy further, fully shifting into something entirely inhuman. I turned to my own demon and asked if I could pull off the same trick. It asked if I actually wanted it to, but I shut that down immediately, pointing out that unleashing something like that in cramped quarters like this was just asking for disaster. As Crimson Darkness barreled toward me, aiming to crush me in one sweeping blow, I told the demon to bring out the sword's aura. The moment it did, I drove my blade straight into her, and she spat out an accusation, calling me a hypocrite. As the blade sank deeper into her shoulder, I honestly wondered what she was even talking about, since that insult felt far too dressed up for someone like her. I kept pushing the aura through until she collapsed entirely, leaving behind something small where the strike had landed, the demon's handprint itself. I picked it up, noting it looked a lot like a chunk of charcoal, and ate it on the spot. What I didn't realize at the time was that Nova had been watching the whole thing from behind a nearby wall. Meanwhile, across the fortress, guards were chasing Hearth down relentlessly, doing everything they could to track him. They eventually cornered him. Before they could act, though, he unleashed his crushing darkness on them and slipped free of the confrontation entirely. He muttered to himself that none of this was supposed to unfold like this, wondering what the Night Hunter and Afflet were even doing, since the plan called for the gates to already be open by now. At this rate, the whole operation was heading toward failure. He might manage to slip away alone, sure, but returning to his master with nothing to show for it amounted to the same thing as dying right there on the spot. There had to be some way out of this for him. That's when a voice reached him, reminding him that consuming the heart of the one favored by mana would carry a mage straight to the pinnacle of power. He tossed Vivian roughly to the ground, deciding that if devouring that heart could grant him strength beyond even his master's, it was worth the gamble, since he was likely dead either way. He pulled out a blade and drove it toward her chest, and right then, an ominous presence closed in on him, the Inquisitor herself, radiating pure killing intent. Hearth immediately hurled a barrage of dark orbs her way, warning her to stay out of his path, questioning what a single Inquisitor could possibly accomplish against someone of his caliber. She simply plowed straight through every orb he threw, leaving him genuinely stunned. This kind of power shouldn't have been possible, easily rivaling that of the Holy Crusaders themselves. Before he could process it further, she crushed his skull with her weapon, declaring that judgment had been delivered to the demon. She kept striking, over and over, with me standing nearby, figuring things were finally winding down. It looked like the dark mages had all been cleared out, and whatever remained, the inner fortress guards could handle on their own. Right around then, Vivian stirred awake again beside me, and once more, I ended up smacking her across the head, apparently overdoing it yet again in the process. That long, brutal night of the Dark Mage invasion finally passed, and by morning, I'd slipped back into my usual routine around Khosrdik. Back in her office, Nova found herself turning the same question over and over, whether I really was a knight, and if so, what exactly had happened in my past to bring me here? Maybe I'd beaten some noble I couldn't stand half to death or something along those lines. She figured I'd probably turn down every promotion beyond guard captain specifically to avoid drawing attention, to keep from crossing paths with anyone from whatever life I'd left behind. Given how essential I'd become to Khosrdik, she decided she couldn't risk my name spreading and losing me from the fortress altogether, so she quietly handed full credit for the previous night's events over to Ben instead. Still, the idea of me actually being a knight didn't sit right with her at all. Just picturing it gave her goosebumps, mostly because I came across as far cooler than some stiff, rule-bound knight ever could. She slapped herself lightly right after that thought, wondering if she'd lost her mind from being up all night. Knight or scoundrel, none of that mattered, she told herself, so long as I stayed put. Her assistant walked in with tea around then, and Nova found herself staring blankly at her chest, wondering what on earth the woman ate to end up with a figure like that, leaving poor Blossom more than a little confused by the attention. Meanwhile, as rain fell that morning, I found myself deeply regretting eating that lump of charcoal-looking demon residue, having spent the entire morning stuck in the bathroom because of it. I asked the demon if that thing had actually been worth the trouble, and it told me I'd be better off seeing the results for myself, instructing me to draw my blade so it could show me power on an entirely different level than before. The moment I did, energy surged through me, my whole body wrapped in what felt like blue flame, an overwhelming rush of strength. So this was how those night types went flying around draped in aura all the time. Then it vanished, just as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me thoroughly confused. The demon explained that had lasted a full 4 seconds, doubled from before apparently. Honestly, I wasn't sure the buildup had matched the payoff, going from a quick flash to a slightly less quick flash. Still, an increase was an increase. If I kept scavenging and eating every demon I came across, maybe I'd genuinely work my way toward becoming a knight eventually. Someone like me, a knight. The thought alone felt absurd. That's when Brighton's voice cut in behind me, relieved to see me arriving early, admitting he'd been worried after I'd vanished so abruptly the day before, asking if everything had turned out all right. I told him that if trouble was what he meant, it had certainly found me. He agreed readily, launching into how nothing mattered more to the clergy than prayer. Back at the tavern, Dylan proudly showed off Kana's latest creation, having carved an actual sculpture of me directly into a mug of beer. He tried to explain something about rolling dice too, but I cut him off with a smack to the head, given Brighton was standing right behind us. Brighton, uninterested in whatever Dylan had been rambling about, asked instead if Kana was my child. which I quickly denied, explaining she was simply a kid I'd taken under my wing. He nodded, admitting he'd noticed something in her expression that reminded him faintly of mine, and apologized to Kana for the assumption. He also praised her carving, remarking he'd never seen detail work this precise, even back in the capital. Brighton mentioned he'd have believed Kana was a sculptor by trade rather than a mage, given the skill on display. Right then, though, the tiny sculpture's neck snapped clean off, leaving everyone standing there a little baffled. Elsewhere, Nova visited Ben, checking in on his condition and reminding everyone present that imperial law forbade touching a knight's body without proper authorization, which was why they'd left him exactly where he'd landed the night before. Ben looked thoroughly defeated, insisting he was fine, and asking what had actually brought her by. Nova gave a small bow, explaining that, as a resident of Kashyyyk, she wanted to formally thank the knight who defended the city. Ben, confused, asked if that was actually him, and she confirmed it, describing how he'd fought off both the demon and the dark mage who'd infiltrated the Lord's fortress using dark magic, sustaining life-threatening wounds in the process. She mentioned hearing that Aaron, the outer wall guard captain, had found him afterward and administered emergency first aid. That detail started painting a clearer picture for Ben. It seemed I'd saved him yet again. How exactly was a man without any aura managing to fell demons on 2 separate occasions now? Nova told him the Lord planned to hand out a generous reward for his efforts, and asked how he wanted that handled. Ben told her to give the whole thing to me instead. She accepted that answer and left, leaving Ben alone with his thoughts, quietly acknowledging that simply being steady clearly wasn't enough anymore. Later, I stopped by to see Nova myself, noticing she was carrying herself a little straighter than usual that day. Something must have been bothering her enough to fix her posture over it. She cleared her throat and explained that Ben had passed his demon-slaying reward directly over to me, and she'd called me in to sort out the details. I asked why he bothered giving it to me at all, and she explained it was because I'd apparently saved his life, mentioning he'd claimed I used 5 potions treating his injuries, information she'd gotten straight from a guard named Dylan. Was that not accurate? I could hardly believe how deceptively useful Dylan had turned out to be, and rode the lie further, correcting her that it had actually been 6 bottles. Nova clearly saw through it, but let it slide, confirming the reward would come in the form of gold coins. That suited me fine, quietly taking credit for the demon subjugation as well, figuring it'd only complicate things if word got out about who'd actually handled that fight. Walking the walls sometime later, I caught sight of the Fenner family's eldest son getting an earful from the Lord, who apparently hadn't expected a demon to show up twice during a routine monster cleanup. He proposed holding a festival to celebrate. Neither Vivian nor Ben seemed particularly enthusiastic about that idea. Having overheard all that, I asked Nova how many people we'd actually lost. She told me 3 soldiers and 2 former inner fortress guards had died. The casualty count had come in lower than feared. Sure, but that hardly made it something to just shrug off as a statistic. I made my way to the home of one of the fallen. The place reeked like a bachelor's den left to rot. If he'd planned on living alone that long, he really should have kept it cleaner. Still, I found some decent liquor sitting on the table and poured myself a drink, though even that tasted strangely hollow going down. I found myself reflecting on how this era really did let people die at a moment's notice, and how genuinely sad it seemed that hardly anyone bothered offering so much as a prayer for them afterward. Something about this age, with empty homes cropping up left and right like this, never sat well with me. At least real estate never ran short around here. I offered up a quiet wish for each of the fallen to rest easy. Right then, Vermin called out to me from the street, urging me to get to the plaza immediately. Kale, standing beside him, couldn't believe the nobles were already throwing their celebration before we'd even properly finished cleaning up the mess. I pushed myself up off the chair, a little irritated. I couldn't even get a moment of quiet reflection without getting yanked back into things. This era really did test my patience sometimes. Meanwhile, out at Bolt Fortress's gates, a guard stopped that same lost giant from before, informing him plainly that this wasn't Kashyyyk, that the actual fortress sat a full day's journey away, and asking what exactly he was even looking for out here. The old man looked genuinely confused, certain he'd followed the directions to the letter. Right then, a rider came galloping through, nearly trampling both of them, shouting for everyone to clear out of his way as he blew straight through the gate without so much as a passing inspection. The guard couldn't believe this particular troublemaker was pulling that stunt again, muttering that with Ben absent lately, the man clearly figured he owned the place outright. The old man asked if that rider was a knight, and the guard confirmed it, though admitted the title felt embarrassing to even apply to someone that disrespectful. The old man brushed past the guard anyway, remarking that he'd apparently found the correct path after all, ignoring the guard's protest about barging through like he owned the place. He made his way straight toward the knight, a sadistic grin spreading across his face. Finally, he'd tracked down a knight. This one, he decided, should run as far and as fast as possible, since that would only stretch out the fun a little longer. Sure enough, that night, the festival kicked into full swing, packed with cheering, drinking, and the occasional brawl breaking out here and there. I wandered through the crowd, keeping the peace, eventually finding myself standing beside a traveling singer performing a ballad about the great Ben, celebrated for cutting down the fire-breathing demon. I recognized the singer instantly, calling him out by name, Benhar, and asked if wandering bard work was really the next career move on his list, suggesting he'd be better off learning to knead dough from his father Hassan the baker instead. Benhar insisted his heart was pulling him in this direction, that he simply hadn't witnessed anything truly soul-stirring yet. But the moment he caught wind of one major event, his craft would naturally sharpen. I told him to do whatever he wanted. It was his life to live after all. Right then, Bremen rushed up beside me, reporting a brawl had broken out in District 6, apparently Scar's crew tangled up with those newcomers from before. I felt a sly grin spread across my face, remarking what a shame this all was, that I'd probably have to go break things up before they spiraled out of hand. Overhearing that, Benhar practically lit up, certain he finally caught the scent of the inspiration he'd been chasing. Scar's crew and the other group were already going at it with real brutality by the time I got there, and I couldn't help calling the lot of them a bunch of children. Once I'd finished my little warm-up watching them flail, I strolled over, remarking that they seemed to be having plenty of fun at the festival, but since playtime was clearly over, it was time they hit the ground properly. Scar's men dropped to their knees the second they recognized me. The rival crew looked baffled, mocking how terrified these guys seemed over a handful of guards, wondering how a group this pathetic had ever managed to run the district in the first place. They kicked one of Scar's men, who immediately turned to me pleading for help, prompting their leader to call it off, reminding them the guards were still very much present. I asked flat out whether he'd started this whole mess. He told me not to make trouble, and George chimed in, reminding me they'd already handed over silver coins, insisting I should have just looked the other way, and kept walking. I stared back at him, half amused. Now I had an actual reason to get involved, and Scar, watching all this unfold, silently thought George really shouldn't have said that. George pressed a knife to my throat, warning that maybe I didn't know better coming from some backwater posting, but I definitely regret getting tangled up in this, insisting they weren't like the amateur wannabes playing gangster around here. I just laughed and drove my fist straight into his face, sending blood spraying and knocking loose a couple of teeth in the process, telling him not to underestimate the frontier. His remaining cronies rushed me after that, and one by one, they all got sent sprawling into the dirt while Scar's crew watched. Benhar, having tailed along the whole time, was practically glowing, convinced this was exactly the inspiration he'd been searching for all along. Eventually, the festival wound down, and life in Kasserdik slipped back into its usual rhythm. I resumed my regular inspection rounds, and during one of them, Kale asked if I'd heard the news that Knight Patroon over at Bolt Fortress had been murdered. Apparently, some giant man had cut off his feet first, then trailed him around afterward, singing like he was stalking prey. Stranger still, despite the fighting that broke out, Patroon had been the only casualty. That got me thinking, given the description, could this be the same lost giant from before? Bolt Fortress sat in the exact opposite direction from where he'd been headed though. Then again, he had specifically asked me if I was a knight too, which made me wonder if he was deliberately hunting knights specifically. Right around then, someone passed through the gate carrying nothing but a cloak and a staff. I told him to stop, since I couldn't let just anyone through unchecked. He explained he was the servant I'd summoned, introducing himself as Dalmuto, the mage out of Tarzan, and confirmed he brought everything he owned along with him, exactly as I'd asked. I recognized him immediately, the washing machine guy from before. He told me he was fully prepared to offer up everything he had, which I understood to mean he genuinely had nothing left beyond his knowledge. I told him I was on duty and we'd talk properly later, directing him to an inn called the Laughing Rabbit. Shortly after that, a large carriage rolled to a stop in front of me, and a man named Jillian introduced himself as a level 5 informant for the Whiteleaf Guild. I told him to step down for inspection, which visibly confused him, apparently assuming I'd misheard who they represented. I didn't particularly care, telling them to get down regardless. Jillian bristled at my tone, but after a quick word with someone still seated inside, both of them stepped out, revealing the Whiteleaf Guild's own Razvet. I asked what exactly brought the Whiteleaf Guild all the way out here. Razvet answered with a faintly sadistic edge, explaining they were scoping out the possibility of opening a branch right here in Kasserdik, hence the preliminary survey. Studying her, I picked up on a distinctly sharp presence radiating off her, though the 3 silver coins she slipped my way were more than enough to earn her a pass regardless. And Kale remarked that Kasserdik must genuinely be developing if an information guild was already looking to set up shop. I wasn't nearly as thrilled about it. Something about the whole arrangement just didn't sit right with me. Jillian, meanwhile, wondered aloud why they'd bothered coming all the way out to such a backwater posting, though Razvet ignored him entirely, clearly fixated on something else, certain she'd seen that particular look on my face somewhere before. Once I made it back to the tavern, everyone had already gathered, Dylan gushing that our little purple-haired genius had really outdone herself this time, with Henna backing him up, insisting she'd always known Kenna was something special, and far too cute besides. I asked what exactly all the fuss was about, and Damuto explained that from what he'd observed, Kenna genuinely had talent, encouraging her to demonstrate what they'd been practicing together. She summoned a stream of cleansing water straight from her hands, scrubbing a mug spotless in seconds. I had to admit, that was impressive. Dishwashing magic apparently now added to her growing list of skills. Everyone showered her with praise, and in the excitement, she nearly ended up trapping Dylan's entire head inside a bubble of water by accident. Not wanting Kana to second-guess herself over the near miss, I shot her an immediate thumbs up, declaring her a genius all over again. Elsewhere, Rasvet had been flipping through a stack of wanted posters, genuinely surprised she hadn't placed someone with such distinctive features sooner. She was certain she'd seen that face somewhere before. Eventually, she landed on it. A considerably younger picture of me. She definitely encountered that face at some point, but though something about him had clearly shifted along the way. Reading further down the poster, the fine print instructed that anyone spotting me should avoid taking any action or making contact whatsoever, and instead report directly to headquarters immediately. Jillian asked if she found something, and his eyes went wide at the sight of the red lettering, since that meant this was a direct order straight from the guildmaster himself, requiring them to head to Karen right away, where they kept birds connected directly to the central communication line. Razvit told him to keep quiet since they had no intention of actually reporting any of this. This, as far as she was concerned, was a genuine opportunity. Simply handing this over would net them nothing worthwhile, she figured. A red-level wanted poster meant someone out there was actively searching for me, and given the priority attached to it, the reward waiting on the other end had to be staggering. Jillian, in that moment, recalled just how fitting Razvet's reputation actually was. The level 3 informant blinded entirely by ambition. His own reputation, meanwhile, amounted to little more than the guy who ate 2 pieces of bread for breakfast. The next day, I carried on with my usual training, and Jillian started trailing me everywhere, scribbling down every move I made. Essentially, they were digging into a red-level target, hoping to identify whoever had put out the request and sell that information for profit. It ran against protocol technically, but orders were orders, and he had to follow them regardless. Surveillance happened to be Jillian's specialty, and as far as he was concerned, I was nothing more than an ordinary guard. He caught sight of the abbot early that morning and wondered if I was running errands for him now. Maybe. He also noted I apparently had access to both cleaning magic and ice magic. A mere guard captain, somehow keeping 2 personal mages on hand, living in a level of luxury even frontier nobles couldn't afford. He figured I had to be running some kind of private operation underneath all of it. He watched me confront an enormous man too, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him straight into the ground, the man offering no resistance whatsoever, which suggested to Jillian that I held real command over Kasadic's underworld. He also observed my meeting with the Order's Inquisitor, noting that beyond the abbot, I clearly had connections there as well. Thugs handed over silver coins and bowed their heads the instant they spotted me. Even Knight Ben from Bolt Fortress approached me directly, apparently on familiar terms. Just who exactly was I? He tailed me the entire day, and rather than piecing together an answer, he only walked away more confused than when he started. Even he couldn't make sense of half of what he'd written down. That night, Razvet continued digging around the fortress, discovering that I'd arrived in Kasserdik roughly 2 years prior with absolutely no records of anything before that point. Around here, I'd simply been labeled a scoundrel, known for a blunt, violent streak. She'd spent the entire day gathering intel, and it still amounted to next to nothing concrete. She remained convinced I had to be some kind of fugitive, though that theory ran into a problem, given how publicly known I'd become for a supposed fugitive. Maybe, she reasoned, she needed to approach this from a different angle entirely. Only a select few carried the authority to issue something like that. The Empire itself, the Order, nobles ranked Marquis or higher, a large-scale mercenary organization, the Magic Tower, and a handful of other prominent figures scattered here and there. Heading back to their hideout, she reasoned it through. Not the Order, certainly, given how close I clearly was with the abbot as an honorary monk. Not the Empire either, since I'd have already been apprehended by now if that were the case. The moment she opened the door to their hideout, something felt off immediately, the air inside carrying a completely different weight than when she'd left. Sure enough, I was standing right there behind the door, remarking what a coincidence it was, and adding that reaching for whatever weapon she had concealed probably wasn't a decision she wanted to make right now. Razvit pointed out this was hardly a coincidence, given this was literally where she was staying, forcing herself to stay composed, despite clearly having miscalculated badly. never expecting me to move this quickly. I remarked, half teasing, that while I appreciated being called handsome, we'd only just met and wondered if she wasn't falling for me a little too fast, tracking my movements and digging through my past like this. Bit much, honestly. Razvet claimed she'd always been the type prone to love at first sight, silently cursing Jillian for how easily he'd let himself get caught up in all this. I told her I had places to be, so we should keep this brief. She seemed curious about who exactly had filed the red letter request. I confirmed the requester was based in Karzan City and explained she'd need to use my own wanted poster as bait to draw that requester out. If she managed that, I'd pay her 50% above the standard commission fee. Genuinely stunned, she asked if I was serious. I pointed out that her head was still firmly attached to her shoulders, which ought to serve as sufficient proof of my sincerity. I pulled out some paperwork and circled a few names, explaining this particular batch related to wall repair funding. Razvet recognized it immediately, as it became clear I'd circled the exact individuals capable of issuing a red letter request, nobles ranked Marquis and above, along with any large-scale mercenary organization. Before she could work through who might satisfy both criteria at once, I slipped away entirely. Razvet stood there momentarily stunned, though ultimately concluding that I really was a genuine mystery, through and through. The wheels, clearly, were already turning, and if she didn't want to end up crushed underneath them, she'd have no choice but to keep pace right alongside it. Sometime later, I found myself sparring with a knight. He lunged forward with his sword, catching me off guard for a beat, though I managed to deflect it off my shoulder armor. That clearly caught him by surprise. I followed up with a counterattack that came within inches of taking his head clean off. Breathing hard, he conceded the match, admitting he'd assumed I'd back off the moment he pressed the attack. He confessed he'd grown dull over the years, leaning too heavily on his aura, and thanked me for the wake-up call. Honestly, I found the whole reaction a little strange, thinking to myself what a peculiar guy, but he insisted he meant every word of it. I just waved him off. He then asked if I'd come from an actual battlefield somewhere, since my fighting style reminded him distinctly of a knight he'd once crossed paths with along the Empire's western front. I just smirked and told him, who knows? Meanwhile, back at the tavern, Jillian spotted some bread sitting on the table and helped himself, wondering idly if Razvet had made him breakfast. He grabbed both loaves, remarking that bread always tasted better pressed together in pairs. Razvet walked in right as he finished, took one look at her own empty plate, and scolded him, pointing out that if there'd been 2 loaves to begin with, the least he could have done was leave her one. Over at the guild's outer headquarters, the heavy-set man stationed there spotted us approaching and immediately clocked it as inspection time, sweat instantly soaking through his clothes. One of my men remarked it looked like the guy was about to keel over on the spot, but I told him to just let it go. Walking through the streets afterward with summer heat bearing down, I found myself wondering if it was finally time to upgrade mini-fridge. Maybe track down Jackson and see about getting my hands on an actual magic book for her. When I reached the gate, I asked why it hadn't been opened yet, and the guards explained, a little rattled, that a crowd had gathered just outside the city waiting. Kale mentioned hearing rumors that, thanks to the ongoing chaos in Karzan, Bolt Fortress had been dealing with a sudden flood of immigrants. Curious, I asked what exactly had happened over there, which sent Kale into a bit of a panic, insisting I shouldn't ask that kind of thing so bluntly. I repeated the question anyway. The other 2 guards filled in the gaps, explaining that beyond the obvious unrest, Karzan had effectively collapsed into a lawless wasteland, the clearest sign being how openly chaotic the streets had become, with people starving and brawling daily just to survive. Hearing that, it dawned on me that I hadn't exactly left things tidy behind me over there. Still, I pushed the thought aside for now, telling the guards to open the gate so we could begin inspections. Stepping out to greet the waiting crowd, I gave them a wide grin, one that visibly unsettled more than a few of them on sight. Kale noted their numbers seemed to have thinned somewhat already, and I told him to get the inspection line moving. I looked over the first man, a shining forehead that practically screamed hard worker, passed. The second had a thick, sturdy build, clearly diligent. Passed. Then came someone I asked the age of. 14, he answered. Passed. Next up, 3 bald men stepped forward together, the orange-haired one among them introducing himself as a former stonemason from Karzan. Studying them, I could tell instantly these 3 knew how to handle themselves in a fight, so I decided to test that theory with my fist. One punch sent the orange-haired man straight to the ground. Looking the group over afterward, weak as they clearly were beneath the surface, they still checked out fine. Passed. The other 2 hoisted their fallen friend up between them and carried him inside. Watching the line, I noticed nearly half the remaining immigrants had quietly turned back the moment they witnessed my inspection method. I figured a guilty conscience was probably driving that retreat, though the guard standing beside me seemed to be reading the situation rather differently. Meanwhile, the trio of former stonemasons made their way further into the city, the middle one still nursing his bruised pride, grumbling about getting punched with zero warning, wondering aloud if coming here had been a genuine mistake, never once imagining a thug like me could actually be a guard captain. The other two decided they'd stick around a little longer regardless, reasoning that I couldn't possibly be everywhere at once. One of them, Gibbs, admitted that strange as this place was, it still beat whatever Karzan had become, and that they had no intention of tangling with someone as unnerving as me ever again, agreeing they'd need to search carefully for lodging. That's when one of them spotted something promising, the Laughing Rabbit Tavern, and feeling good about the choice, the group headed inside. At the same time, Razvit had been narrowing down her list of suspects behind my wanted poster, landing on one name in particular, the former King Ethan, who, after the fall of the Byzantine kingdom, had been granted the title of Marquis and submitted to imperial authority. She found herself wondering exactly what connection I might have to a man like that. That's when I spoke up behind her, startling her mid-thought, remarking she looked lost in whatever she was working through. She quickly tucked her research away, asking what I was even doing there. I told her I'd come to keep an eye on her, in case her mind started wandering somewhere it shouldn't. She shot back with a sly joke, claiming I was already the only thing occupying her thoughts. I let her know I'd be back the following day, then slipped into my usual routine, claiming I'd just been passing by and figured I'd drop off a housewarming gift. Judging by how she looked, she'd already had a taste of the fish cake. The next day, Jillian spotted another loaf of bread sitting out and helped himself without hesitation, only for his expression to shift dramatically mid-bite. Turned out to be fish cake bread, and he found himself wondering who on earth had made something like this. Razvit walked in right then, mentioning she'd heard it was actually a local specialty of the city, and that since it was morning, he might as well finish his breakfast properly. Jillian, a man who typically ate 2 loaves every morning without fail, quietly made himself a private vow right then and there, never to let himself get pulled in by whatever feelings Razvit seemed to be throwing his way. Inside the Laughing Rabbit Tavern, Minnie Fridge proudly showed off her latest sculpture to the 3 stonemasons, with the orange-haired one squinting at it, certain the face looked oddly familiar. She stretched her hand out toward them right after, making it clear that since the show was over, payment was due. The man could hardly believe he'd just gotten shaken down by a small child, though his companion, the one everyone had taken to calling the rabbit guy, found the whole thing endearing enough to suggest they just eat first and worry about it later. As they chewed, a piece of bread slipped and hit the floor, and the moment it did, they noticed every eye in the tavern had turned toward them expectantly. The rabbit guy couldn't figure out what the fuss was about over a dropped crumb, until it dawned on him that every noise they made seemed to draw the same expectant stares from the crowd. Deciding that since this was where they'd chosen to settle down, first impressions mattered, they figured they might as well give the room exactly what it seemed to be waiting for, and promptly sent the rest of their food crashing to the floor. That's when the door swung open, and I stepped inside to find the 3 of them apparently having the time of their lives. I couldn't help wondering why this tavern had gotten so loud, figuring a fresh batch of troublemakers had rolled into town. With a flash of irritation, I announced that it looked like I'd be putting in some overtime tonight. The moment the regulars spotted me, their faces lit up with pure delight. The rabbit guy finally understood, watching all this unfold, that the entire crowd had simply been waiting around for a proper show. After making quick work of the 3 of them, I had to admit they were disappointingly weak, though they did technically pass whatever personality test I'd apparently been running, and I made a mental note to sharpen my standards a bit next time around. Hannah called me over shortly after, mentioning that Canna's iced beer had absolutely no competition anywhere in Kassertik these days, and that she'd already cooked up a scheme to turn that into a fortune rivaling anyone in the Eastern Empire. That admission genuinely caught me off guard. She then turned to the rabbit guy, informing him they owed compensation for some furniture, and when he protested that they hadn't actually broken anything, she countered that they could simply work off the debt for free instead. Listening to this unfold, I already knew exactly how messy this arrangement was about to get. She went on to tell them they'd be allowed to use my name, meaning nobody in their right mind would dare lay a hand on them. She explained the pay would start low given the initial investment and risk involved, and by then, they were already thoroughly hooked. Watching it play out, I figured these guys were genuinely fortunate to have landed with Henna, since the alternative would have likely been ending up shipped off on some Kraken hunting vessel past the Jurten mountain range instead. Not long after, rain began to fall as the clouds overhead darkened. A messenger pigeon arrived carrying word for Razvet, who sorted through the contents, discarding anything useless, focused entirely on whatever concerned me. Reading it over, she found herself baffled by just how many different nicknames had piled up around my name. She'd been hoping to sell whatever she'd gathered on me to interested buyers, but everything she'd collected turned out to be garbage. Right then, she noticed someone stepping inside with a wide grin, mentioning he'd been waiting on her. It was Jillian. She snapped at him immediately, demanding to know why he insisted on using the hole in the wall instead of the actual door like a normal person. He explained it was simply the easier route, then turned the question back on her, asking why she'd been waiting around for him, adding that she was undeniably beautiful, though her personality ran in the exact opposite direction. She responded by triggering her personal defense charm, a built-in strike spell limited to 3 uses total, burning through 2 of them squarely on Jillian, taking genuine satisfaction in the process. Glancing back down at her documents afterward, she landed on yet another nickname attached to me, something along the lines of the one who ruined the kingdom, and found herself wondering exactly what that was supposed to mean. She finished off the exchange with Jillian by landing one final hit, this one costing her 2 gold coins to power, though as far as she was concerned, it had been money well spent. Somewhere else, out in that same falling rain, a lone traveler crossed paths with 2 hooded figures on the road, asking if they were migrants heading toward Caserdic, warning them they'd be better off going elsewhere given the recent dark mage and demon attacks, not to mention rumors of unusually savage guards stationed there. As the 2 figures closed the distance, the traveler dropped lifeless to the ground without warning. One of them remarked, almost surprised, that they'd actually traveled all the way out to this particular frontier. His companion pointed out that this town had become the talk of the region lately, home to the Lord's daughter, celebrated as the legendary beauty known as the Flower of the East, and, as it happened, their actual target. The one doing most of the talking turned out to be a skeleton, the so-called nightmare eater, Darbin, who mentioned that given his rank, he'd fill his companion in on why the society preferred sending them out in waves rather than committing their full strength at once. His partner, though, wasn't particularly curious about any of that, finding himself far more distracted by the odd habit of a skeleton's jaw moving with every word, privately admitting that if Darbun weren't his superior, Darbin explained, regardless, that an operation of this scale, a sprawling underground organization like theirs, survived only because it received a kind of unofficial protection from the Empire itself. He admitted he didn't fully understand the reasoning, only that as long as they stuck to certain guidelines, the Empire chose to look the other way. Beyond that, he added, they already had bigger headaches to deal with, namely how rebellious the dark mages and demon vessels tended to be. He clarified quickly, though, that this criticism didn't extend to Dune. Dune, for his part, decided to tune out the rest of the conversation, drifting instead toward the idea that he deserved a cooler title than fledgling. Darbin interrupted that train of thought, telling him to wipe the rainwater off before his bones started rotting, adding that opportunities to bond like this, fellow breathless creatures out on the road together, didn't come around often. He kept guiding his soldiers forward as Dune continued turning his hypothetical nickname over in his head. Eventually, Darbin draped an arm across Dune's shoulders, laying out the plan plainly. He'd feed Dune fear, steadily, until he finally outgrew the fledgling label entirely. Once he'd matured enough to handle the knight standing in their way, Darbin would personally take care of everything left over. As a fledgling, Dune couldn't access his true strength until he'd consumed enough fear to fuel it, and cultivating fear in the weak happened to be Darbon's particular specialty. He declared their partnership a perfect match. Dune could barely tolerate the man's endless chatter at this point, though he couldn't deny their respective abilities genuinely complemented one another. With that settled, the 2 of them set off to spread a proper wave of fear across Caserdic.